Part 5. Rishans. 191, post-treaty. Horth pelted down the promenade towards Liege Brillet's quarters after a panic-stricken 7-year-old Dorn who had come to fetch him. "She's berserk," Dorn warned his sire as he halted, eyes wide and body breathless. Horth laid a hand on his son's shoulder. "Go," he said, and waited until Dorn obeyed. He burst in on Brillet, in time to see her hurl a pitcher of ship's ale at the ceiling. "Watch that!" Brillet raged at whichever of the watching dead she evidently meant to nail with her projectile, and swept up the next thing on the table where she and Horth often had breakfast together. 12! She railed, and shook her fist at her disembodied ancestors. 12 babies I've given you. Go bless another descendant. She was casting about for something else to throw when she spotted Horth. "You!" she roared, and launched herself at him. Horth had heard that the hormones associated with early pregnancy could be murderously hard on a woman as Relish as Brillet, whose blood was typically laced with as much testosterone as any man's. But he had not realized until now that the male responsible was the one most likely to get murdered. Brillet hit him like a rel fighter doing 6 skim facts, knocking the breath out of Horth's lungs. They crashed into the low table at the foot of the wide bed where the damage had been done. Pain stabbed him in the ribs as they rolled over a piece of broken furniture. Horth tried to hang on to prevent Brillet from getting enough clearance to swing at him, or strike him with her forehead. She broke his grip with a roar, reared up, and swung down with a 2-fisted blow. Horth heaved her sideways, spoiling her aim, and rolled on top of her. The next thing he knew, she had her legs locked around his waist and was forcing a kiss on him. Slowly, muscles still straining, he let their body contact transform from violence into passion. He was grateful for the change, but wary of a relapse. 20 minutes later, naked and panting with the stress of spent emotions, they found themselves lying on the bed together. Brillet lay staring at the ceiling with sweat cooling on her limbs and torso. "It's bad timing," she explained away her earlier outburst as she heaved herself up. "Wait," she ordered him before stalking, naked, across her quarters to retrieve something on the far side. She returned with a slim silver box in her hand. It was oblong in shape, with round edges. Horth could not imagine what it was for. "Rishan," Brillet said, "but not an old war artifact. A new thing." He started as if she had told him it was carrying a fatal virus. "It has pictures on it," she said. "Pictures of that dancer from Den Eva's, named Vaughn, being molested. I'll show you how it works. Watch." Brillet stroked her hand over the box in a smooth motion and its surface lit up, exciting the air above. Images resolved themselves into a solid-looking display. The technology intrigued Horth, but the images repelled him. He was looking at children in a slaw den, the sort of place that catered to abusive fetishes. The children in view were boys being mauled by a man in an unmistakably sexual manner. The children looked no older than Dorn. Horth found himself boiling with anger. "These things are showing up at the worst sort of trading stations across Killing Reach," Brillet told him. She tossed the silver box onto their abandoned bed. "But they seem to feature the underdogs on Gileon. How could the Rishans have been there? And what do they mean by selling such filth back to us? Sheer mockery? Or is it some sort of vulgar challenge?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but they might know on Gileon. See what you can find out there, and then take word to your liege father." She lay her large hand across the flat skin of her belly. "I cannot go myself this early in a pregnancy, not with a clear conscience." Horth nodded, understanding now why she had been so upset. "This is not good," she told Horth, her gravity undiminished by her nakedness. "It is not good that there are Rishans in Killing Reach again. We must do something. Hanks must decide what." Horth nodded. That much seemed obvious, but his limitations as a messenger concerned him. "Cessner Sal will have called Brance to court," said Brillet. "Be sure you connect with him. He might have some information from the Monatees. Horth grinned at the idea, feeling better. The flying was clear all the way to court. Horth encountered the most traffic in the reach of Gillian, but that was normal because Gillian lay at the hub of a network of reaches. It was only as his envoy craft reached atmosphere that Horth encountered bad weather, of the planetary sort. But he enjoyed the mind-clearing demands of bringing his ship down through a dust storm of moderate proportions. When he was hailed by the Ava's tower, Horth identified himself as a Nersalian highborn. "Highborn," the male Demish voice responded as if stung. "Which one? We've already cleared Brands Nersal today. Word is the rest of you aren't interested in the Ava's empire anymore because Liege Nersal prefers wooing Nessax." Horth cut the channel off without dignifying the Demish man's remarks with a response. He wasn't sure what to say anyway. He was glad to get out of the storm and into the highborn chute. On the docks themselves, he headed for the hangar he knew Brance preferred to use and parked right outside the wide porch that led up to a long common room. Horth had taken 6 steps from his ship when Brance charged out the doors and down the steps of the porch, arms flung wide. "Thank you, ancestors," cried Brance. "It's you!" Horth dropped his travel bag and sword to greet his brother with a round of back-pounding slaps and hugs. Then, he crouched over his travel bag to dig out the offensive little box, stood up again, and handed it to Brance. "What is it?" his brother said, taking it with a bemused expression and turning it over in his hands. "Rishon," said Horth. Brance looked keenly interested now. "Really? Daimon's got a Rishon here, you know, staying in Green Hearth, and his skin is really brown just like in the stories from Killing War." He paused to examine the featureless oblong shape in his hand. "What does it do?" Horth lifted his chin in the direction of the porch and headed inside. Brance followed. A half-dozen curious hangar staff made way for them as they passed inside. Horth recognized a commoner who did maintenance engineering and nodded to him. He did not understand why the man looked so pleased by that simple acknowledgement, but he didn't waste time thinking about it much. Horth felt at home inside the hangar. It was well built and practical. Tables and chairs filled one side, and a locker room occupied the other. Its open spaces mixed with private cubicles. A staff member appeared at Horth's elbow and said, "I'll show you to the highborn quarters," upspeaking him 4 berth ranks. Horth could use a change of clothes after his trip, and a chance to freshen up. He went with her, leaving the Rishon box for Brance to examine. It crossed Horth's mind that if Brance figured out how to make it work, he might be spared explaining anything about it. Half an hour later, Horth was back, dressed in casual court clothes he had found in a well-stocked closet, with his sword on his hip. His borrowed attire displayed no markings unique to him personally, but declared him a Nersalian highborn. Brance was seated at a table in the dining area with plates of snacks set out. All his attention, however, was fixed on the Rishon box, watching a scene with an expression of mesmerized horror. Horth turned the box off with a sweep of his hand to announce his arrival. Brance started at the interruption. "I don't understand," Brance said, blinking at Horth. "These pictures, they were recorded here on Gillian. If they are real." He paused. "Do you think someone created this to slander the Ava? I mean, because his Admiral Harath is featured in a very bad light. Gods ignore us. The man molests boys." He paused again, getting agitated. "It looks real, but gods, it shows things I would have never imagined possible no matter how slaw a den was. Things being done to children? And it looks as if it all takes place through the eyes of that dancer from Den Eva's, Vaughn, who seems to be much younger in some scenes than others. Almost as if these are memories." Brance stopped there, distraught. "What does it mean?" he asked hoarsely. Horth shook his head. All he knew was that he did not like the silver box. Whether it lied or told the truth, it made a joke of Sevalite honor. Brance ran stiff fingers through his mop of black hair with a great sigh. "Strange things are happening here, too. You've heard of the Demish rebel, Peridor?" "From Killing Reach," said Horth. Brance nodded. There's been a horrible transgression, with power weapons, at Den Eva's. Brett Lavrel was wounded. People say Peridor was at fault. I was going to go to find Daimon to learn more, but he's gone off-planet somewhere. Brance nibbled his lower lip a moment before adding, after he sent Brett Lavrel to Touchgate Hospital. Horth hissed. I know, cried Brance, but Daimon did it to save her life, not to violate her soul. Horth frowned, reserving judgment for the moment about Daimon. He didn't like the way Brance continued to toy with the silver box, as if he meant to turn it back on. Horth was not interested in seeing the vile scenes again. Something worries me about this thing, said Brance, as he toyed with the box in his hands. It could be pure invention. We know that Laurels can do that, so why not Rishans? But if it isn't, and the details are so good, if it is real... He broke off, looking tortured. Horth sat down and started eating strips of jerky from a serving tray, dipping them in a thick gray-brown sauce that he washed down with pilot's nectar. It was long minutes before Brance mastered his qualms enough to go on. I saw something once, he said, in a Monetese library on Sanctuary. Pictures from a long time ago, a time when... Brance looked up at his brother with a blighted expression. Horth swallowed the jerky he was chewing and put the rest of the stick down. The Laurels, said Brance. They used to use the same technology on us that we still use to bind Garerel Pol. Used it to bind the Vrelish, Brance stuttered. You know how the Laurels destroyed souls? Horth had heard those stories. It was one of the reasons why honorable people, like Keen, would rather die than accept Laurel-tainted help. He encouraged Brance with one curt nod. The pictures I saw on Sanctuary? Brance bit his lip. Slowly, he set his fist down on the silver box. The Laurels used to do things like this to Devish Sevelites. Rape a living brain to harvest its experiences. Oh gods, Horth, that's what these pictures look like. If it is, then Rishans must be Laurels of the worst sort. Horth was stunned. Except, Brance faltered, Vaughn's a commoner. How could he survive? How could it even work? He spread his right hand over his eyes. They remained like that, in silence, for long seconds. Then, Horth put a hand on Brance's shoulder, and his brother looked up with anguish in his green eyes. I swear, he promised Horth, his voice quavering. I swear that I'll stand with the family, even against Monitum, if Rishans use science like that to master Sevelites. He tensed up. But I can't believe Daimon would be sheltering a Rishan if they condoned things like that. Horth frowned. He had lived and worked in Killing Reach. He knew what the world looked like when you let people mock honor. He felt his jaw tighten and his chest swell. We had better get back to Black... Brance began, and was interrupted by Cess Nersal barging in. Brance! Cried the noble-born Nersalian. The Red Vrelish! 2 of them have come to court looking for Daimon. A car from Cess's garage picked them up when they were clear of the docks. Daimon's not back, reported the female driver, who was dressed in the garage uniform. The man in the seat beside her was fussing over a noisy signal on a shortwave radio console built into the dash of the car. Where are we going? Brance demanded. After Liege Cert of Red Reach, said the man, hunting an elusive signal and without turning his head. Liege Cert went to Green Hearth, apparently out for Daimon's blood over him sending Bretla to Touchgate Hospital. But Daimon was not there, and she left again with 2 of the most unlikely people. Daimon's new Leica, Eva, and that Rishan Daimon is harboring. What's really interesting, though, continued the driver as she turned towards the Demish residential area known as the Apron District, is that the Demish have gone after them in force. First Delm's last paladin on planet named Thoth, and then a visiting tournament champion from Princess Reach. Hendrix Dastor, cried Cess Nersal, the Pan-Demish tournament champion. While they talked, their car made its way past the Apron District at the foot of the Citadel towards the streets beyond. This sector of the Palace Plain was given over to light industry organized into blocks. Each block had its own buildings and area to park. Some had fences around them, and some did not. The time of day in the underground city was just before dawn, which was generally referred to as lights up for the sake of its suddenness. They drove into semi-darkness with their car's headlights on, going as fast as the driver dared while the man beside her took directions over a shortwave radio from Confederates tracking the Demish cars they pursued. The reception was not good. Radio signals bounced chaotically around the hull-steel shell of Undergelion. Using shortwave overcame that problem, or could have, if rival houses had not made it a hobby to jam each other's signals or to try to eavesdrop, which, together, with an ongoing war over standards, made communications unreliable. Their Salians were more persistent than most about countering Demish sabotage and inflicting their own. Many houses simply gave up, unable to invest in the ongoing communications war that had crippled or discredited methods of signaling that did not rely on personal contact or the use of blood ciphers to encode and authenticate them. The comm man cursed more than once. "Somebody's flooding our channel," he griped aloud. But it didn't matter. They already had their target in sight. Horth gave Branst a nudge and pointed at 2 speeding Demish cars just ahead of them that bore a silver Demish crest. They were driving down a wide street with a central boulevard, approaching an establishment that looked like some sort of food-raising enterprise. The main building was box-like, with a fenced-in yard. They were at the back of the complex, so there was no grand entrance or carefully tended lawn. People were trickling out onto the yard to watch what was going on. Demish cars marked with the Ava's rose and sword device were parked on both sides of the road. As Horth watched, Hendrix Dastor's car pulled off the road ahead of them, disgorging people. The lighting shed by glow plastic on poles along the street was dim, to simulate night, but Horth could make out a stylishly dressed Demish prince. Their own car drew up near the 2 filled with Dastor's people. Brandt sprang out. Horth followed him. He could see tanks in the backyard by now, identifying the place as a hydroponics farm. Delm's paladin, Thoth, was confronting Liege Surt of Red Reach, in plain view on the street. Floodlights mounted on the hoods of Prince Dastor's cars were turned on suddenly, lighting the area better, but Dastor made no move to intervene. Horth guessed the Demish prince was there for the same reason as Branson himself, to bear witness. But it did not look like there was going to be a duel. The paladin lacked the nerve. He seemed inclined to talk, instead. As negotiations began, Horth noticed 2 people wearing traveling cloaks who caught his attention by bolting off towards the farm building. Horth did not know what to make of that, except it seemed odd. "Thoth wants Dastor to fight for him," Branst hissed to Cess under his breath. "Uh-huh," she agreed. Dastor did not seem interested in taking up the challenge, however. The Red Vrelish challenger concluded that the duel was off and left the Demish to their argument. Horth looked to see what had happened to the 2 people who had run off, but Cess said, "There's a duel pending on the Octagon over Peridor." She looked to Branst for a decision. "Shouldn't we be there?" Branst bit his lip. "I don't know," he said, "but Tessitad might be at Green Hearth. She'll tell me what's happening." Branst and Cess talked about bizarre events occurring in Undergelion as they drove back to the stairs that led up to the Citadel. Horth understood, basically, that there was more than one Retian box around causing trouble. A mob had attacked the pregnant wife of Delm's admiral, Hareth, on the assumption that her child would be tainted by the same boy-slaw nature that her husband had demonstrated in the Retian images. "Why do people believe the pictures are genuine?" Branst asked Cess, nervously. "Gelax don't trust recordings. They are too easy to meddle with, or just invent." "There's a rumor that Daimon is taking the silver box seriously," Cess replied. She indulged in a worried frown. "Daimon doesn't consider sometimes how people interpret the things he does, like taking that Retian into Green Hearth. What are Civilites to make of him harboring the person who, for all we know, could be responsible for that abominable silver box?" "I still don't understand what the point of it is," protested Branst. "Why go to all that trouble to show us the ugly side of Gelion?" Cess Nersal had all kinds of ideas about that, but Horth tuned her out. He was remembering the 2 people back at the hydroponics farm who ran around the building, and wondering if he had glimpsed a dark face beneath the hood of one traveling cloak, or if it had merely been shadows. At the base of the stairs leading up to the roof of the citadel, Cess halted with a groan and rubbed her leg with the old wound. Horth picked her up without a word and had no problem keeping up with Brance despite the burden. They did, however, get some funny looks. "Thanks," Cess said gruffly, when he put her down abruptly at the top. They passed unhindered through a thick line of Demish swordsmen guarding the palace shell. Not only were there more of them on guard than usual, but at least 6 of them were highborns, and some were showing signs of nervousness. Horth made one blonde prince start just by looking at him, which he rather enjoyed. "Something's up," Brance muttered under his breath. They kept up a brisk pace across the plaza. When they reached Black Pavilion, Horth was glad to see a handful of errants he recognized. Their leader saluted Brance, avoiding eye contact with Horth. "Good to see you, Scion Nersal," said the leader. "Glad I made it on time, Tommen," said Brance. "Can you tell me exactly what's going on?" Tommen shook his head. "Nothing beyond the obvious. Peridor has been accused of the Okalani attack on Vretlavrel. Prince de Ander is supposed to be standing for her, but he's not here yet. Henrix Dastor, he's a tournament champion." I know, said Brance. "I'm not Red Vrelish, you know. I pay attention to what happens at court." Tommen nodded. "Dastor is supposed to fight on Delm's behalf." "There's got to be more to this," exclaimed Brance, running a hand through his tousled hair as they made their way down into Black Hearth. Servants came out to greet them within minutes, including Alice, who ran straight into Brance's arms. He treated her with cool affection, letting her shelter there like a child for a moment before moving her firmly into Cook's keeping. 12 people comprised the entire Black Hearth staff, including the medic Gererl Pull, Naris, a herald, and 6 noble-born errants. Horth doubted the errants were even full-time residents. Cess may have called them back to duty, much as she had done with Brance. Brance greeted each of the errants with expressions of friendship and gratitude, saying things like, "Glad to have you with us." Horth hovered at his elbow. "I'm going to see what I can find out at Green Hearth," Brance announced when no one had fresh information to offer. Horth decided not to follow. He was watching Alice. He wondered if she would ever want to throw herself into his arms. The fertility issue still confounded him, but he couldn't help wondering why he found commoners like Alice desirable, if he wasn't supposed to want one to have his baby. Was it his wild Vrelish blood? He let the question drop when Alice noticed him staring at her and blanched as if she'd been challenged to a duel. He did not like it, and kept his eyes off her after. Brance returned 10 minutes later. "Tessatat isn't home," he said. Then he and Cess went off to find a comfortable place to talk. To avoid Alice problems, Horth tagged along. An errant came to find them when it was time for the duel on the octagon. Brance and Horth went to stand witness on Black Wedge, accompanied by Cess and a pitiful handful of errants. The Red Vrelish highborns they had seen outside the hydroponics farm stood on Red Wedge, in Vretless Place, surrounded by nobleborns from Spiral Hall. Ava Delm himself was on display in the midst of princes and princesses on Silver Wedge. Banks of Demish spectators surrounded him, with more on Blue Wedge. People took note of Brance's small party, but the octagon's attention was soon seized by the appearance of a Demish woman dressed in very ordinary-looking pants and top, who was marched out with her arms bound and a gag in her mouth. Beside Horth, Brance said, "Peridor." Horth knew the name. Deor had rebelled against Delm in Killing Reach a generation before, and had been vindicated by the Golden Prince Dandur when the Silver Demish unwisely appointed him as Judge of Honor. Horth knew no particular evil of Peridor, but he did not find it hard to believe she might have dropped the Shield of Honor, because people said that she had small regard for Okal Rel in general. As Prince Husa of the Silver Demish read the charges, Horth found himself remembering Hara. It was Hara who taught him that everything worth stealing depended on trust to be created, and therein lay the paradox that honor guarded. "Let others make the mistakes," she had told him, "just like in a duel, and when they do, be ruthless. Take from those who drop the Shield of Honor. There are more than enough of them for you to gain all you will ever need, honorably, and the struggle will never consume the precious things you fight for." Even in a case as apparently simple as obtaining Alice, Horth recognized the truth in it. What would he have if he gained her dishonorably? Not Alice, just a broken spirit in a captive body. Horth's feelings were so intense and internal, while he worked his way through the pain of unanticipated temptation, that he did not catch any of the details in Prince Husa's long-winded declarations. But he knew they would be about the charges against Peri d'Or, and the terms of the duel between her defender, Dander, and Prince Hendrix d'Astor, acting in the capacity of throne champion. Only the start of the duel snapped him out of it. Even then, Horth watched the two Demish swordsmen with no more than an academic interest as they tested each other, neither one very keen to get serious. Then the crowd's attention wavered as Daimon appeared, not on green wedge, but blue. Daimon moved quickly through the spectators on blue wedge, a girl's voice crying, "Vaughn! Vaughn!" from within the ranks of blue Demish he had left behind him. The paladin, Thoth, beat Daimon to Delm's flower-covered seat, carrying a dark-haired boy about 2 years old. Noticing the toddler's head jerk at the last echo of Vaughn, coming from blue wedge, Horth assumed the unseen woman must be his mother, and his eyes narrowed. Thoth placed the child in Delm's lap and sunk to his knees before his idol. "Light of divine beauty of soul," he implored, "I have heard you accused of seeking this child's death, madness in itself. The reason defies hearing. Therefore I beg you to genotype him now, before Seveldom assembled." The paladin went on a bit, but Horth stopped listening. Beside him, Cess Nersal had gone rigid with alarm, her attention fixed on Daimon. While the Demish babbled, Daimon kept coming. When he stopped, he shouted accusations in a ringing voice that seized attention. "The child on your lap is your grandson," Daimon told Delm, "and even if you break his neck, his genes will still condemn you." He jerked his head in Peri d'Or's direction. "She is nothing but a scapegoat for what you did at Den Eva's to eliminate a child that Vaughn, the courtesan, had sired. A child you had to kill because you had discovered Vaughn was pureblood Amel, your son." Beside Horth, Brant started with a shock. "Amel?" he gasped. Prince Husa of the Silver Demish descended on Daimon. He was a big man, as old as Horth's father and equally vigorous, with thick sandy eyebrows, ornate Demish clothing, and wide shoulders. "My dear Daimon," the Silver Demish prince appealed to reason, "you've been flying too hard. Ran into some trouble, I expect, eh? Out in Killing Reach?" Daimon narrowed his eyes. "Draw or step aside," he warned dangerously. Cess Nersal started forward, but Brant stopped her. Husa leaned towards Daimon to speak privately. He even clapped Daimon on the shoulder, making him start violently. There was more talking, and then suddenly, Daimon punched Husa in the stomach and cleared his sword all in one motion. Cess Nersal caught her breath. Brant got out a strangled, "No!" Daimon's sword went through Delm's throat, despite the devoted attendant who tried to get between them. Delm crashed to the floor. Daimon went with him. Women screamed. People ran away. Others ran to where Delm thrashed, arterial blood spurting. Someone cried, "Hold them down!" in a panic. Branst and Cess dashed across the challenge floor. Horth followed Branst. The Red Relish were already uniting with Green Hearth retainers in a spontaneous show of Relish solidarity. Prince Husa of Silver Hearth set a sword at Daimon's throat as his men held the prisoner motionless before him. "You'll die disgraced on Ava's square for this, you Relish animal," Husa raged. Black, green, and red. The Relish formed a crescent line, cupping the scene. It was Liege Cert of Red Reach who spoke for them. "You can fight me for the privilege of killing him later," she told Prince Husa. "If you're still so inclined, once we know who this wretched child is." "Show us the child!" Brance exclaimed excitedly. "Now, or more blood will spill!" Horth stood his ground, backing Branst up, but he wished the odds were better. The churning around Delm stopped suddenly. Prince d'Astor came forward, his sleeves soaked in Delm's blood. "He's dead," he said, sounding stunned. "The Ava is dead." "Genotype the child," Prince Husa said through gritted teeth, and glared at the Vrelish, whose stand on Daimon's behalf demanded that much fairness in the process. Horth was not at all clear about why genotyping the boy was so important, except that it had something to do with the lost prince, Amel. He was on the challenge floor, quite simply, because Branst was. Daimon caught Sesnersal's eye and spoke, starting a trickle of blood where the sword pressed his throat. Eva and the Rishan, they're in Blue Hearth. Ses took that as an order to go fetch them out. Branst nudged Horth to go with her as backup. He followed her up the stairs into Black Hearth and out again onto Fountain Court. The door to Blue Wedge stood open. The man who had opened it was dragging the unconscious body of the courtesan named Eva, trying to get her out. As he looked up over his shoulder, Horth saw his face was a light caramel brown and blinked in shock. He had never seen a Rishan before. Ses gestured, and Horth went to hold off a couple of Blue Hearth errants who appeared at the inward end of the hall. The errants had no right to oppose Horth without Delm's explicit orders, because Horth outranked them, but the situation was fluid enough that Horth was glad to be clear of it without testing anyone's grasp of sword law. Back in Black Hearth, Ses turned Eva over to cook. "Would you stay here?" Ses asked Horth. "Daimon is my McCanst. I need to go back down there." Horth was worried about Branst too, but he nodded. To his surprise, the brown-faced Rishan went after Sesnersal. Horth waited in Black Hearth, bewildered by the whole affair. He prowled back and forth between the entrance hall and spiral stairs, feeling like a wardship guarding two jumps at the same time. He was not aware of how tense he was until things broke up on the octagon, and Branst came flying up the stairs, exclaiming, "Tessatat's all right. She's just minding Vretla on Touchgate Hospital." Branst acted as if this had always been the crucial issue. It was hours before Horth got the facts straight in connection with the bigger picture. What mattered was this. The dancer named Vaughn was the lost pureblood Amel, and that gave the images on the Rishan box a new significance. "A Demish highborn," Branst kept saying, in a dozen variations. Rishans can extract Demish memories just like Lorels used to, and if they can do that, does that mean they have the science to control Vrelish pilots as well? Take captives and use our own pilots against us? Nersalian tradition was to die before being taken prisoner by dishonorable enemies. Brant's worries gave Horth a whole new appreciation for the reason. "You've got to take the box to Dad at once," was Brant's conclusion. "I'd come too, but Tessatat might need my help with the Red Vrelish when she gets back. They won't like her taking their liege to Touchgate Hospital." Guessing the cause of Horth's dismayed expression, Brant set his hand on Horth's shoulder. "The box explains itself," he told his brother. "Just take it, and tell Dad the Rishans can do that to a Sevolite." Horth got out of his envoy ship on the runway outside the estate where Liege Nersal was holding court on Tark, in Alliance Reach. He was met by one of Zersarn's fanatics, a Nessak named Falk, with a narrow face and hard eyes that looked out from a soul that must have been so brutally embittered in a past life that it could find no joy in this one. As he followed Falk off the landing strip, Horth wondered how the Nessaks were coping with the fact that the vast majority of Tarkians were not highborns, and there were millions of them. Mother and Zersarn could not empty Tark of non-Eternals the way they had tried to do at Black Hearth. Hangst held court on Tark at a country estate on the outskirts of a city built to serve a major spaceport. Slow trucks, powered by the usual ecologically friendly methods, dotted a distant road. Beyond that lay a field of solar collectors milking power from the cool autumn rays of Tark's sun. The terrain behind the estate was backed by forested foothills infested by the pesky native creatures known as grabbets. The thought of grabbets reminded Horth of hunting with Kale on San Home. Falk led Horth into a courtyard where 3 children were at play, dressed up in ill-fitting costumes. Eller was 7 now, a skinny, energetic child wearing an improvised Admiralty headdress and waving a toy sword in mock combat. The girl he played with was about 3. She struggled valiantly to hold her sword steady in front of her. "I don't care what you think, you vile Vrelish creature," Eller declared. "I will have a wife if I want." The 3rd child was a physically precocious infant. She claimed everyone's attention by falling off the stone bench she was trying to scale, letting out a shriek of indignation as she landed. Horth scooped her up before Eller got to her. Relish mothers said their infants knew a relative by scent. Whatever the reason, the agile baby settled down quickly in Horth's arms. Her reaction pleased him. Eller was less comfortable with his intervention. He looked to Falk for assistance. "I will take Sanal," Falk said to Horth, lifting the baby away from him. "Thank you." He gave the infant to Eller. "This way," he told Horth, and led on again. Horth tried to make eye contact with Eller, but the child avoided his gaze. Reluctantly, Horth followed his Nessak guide across the courtyard and into the estate, to a suite of rooms that Falk explained were guest quarters. "Liege Nassau will see you at his leisure," Falk told him. "In the meantime, the servants will see to you." "Servants?" Horth asked, surprised. "Yes," Falk said with a bit of a sneer. "It is seductive to have soulless ones about in that capacity. In my time here, I've come to understand the temptation they pose." He left without discussing it further. Horth unpacked the few things he had brought with him and showered. When he came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a white towel, he found his mother standing by his dresser, staring at the Retian box. She had managed to turn it on. Horth noticed at once she was pregnant again. The next thing he noticed was how bloodless her face looked, and how her stare had a sharp gleam of something brittle about it. "Horth?" she said in a raw voice. Her eyes flickered down to the holographic scene of a girl not much older than Eller who was being sexually assaulted by a cruel-looking man in a room with shabby furniture. The pictures captured little of Amel himself, because they were recordings of his memories. Just a wisp of black hair when it fell across his eye, and a glimpse of his own blood-smeared hand as he pushed himself up off the floor, setting Horth's teeth on edge for the sake of the whimper that escaped him. That was no way for a Sevalite to face a Slakast. The child Amel in the images made a frantic attack. The chaos of the mismatched struggle irked Horth by giving him such detailed information. He would have done it better, even as a child against a grown man. Angry, he took 3 swift steps to Beryl's side and swept his hand over the box, turning the images off. His mother stood between him and the dresser where the hated object sat. "I came," she stopped with a hiccup of pure distress. "I came to welcome you to—" But her eyes stayed back to the thing that had disturbed her. "It is Retian," Horth said. "A memory." "Of the Retian homeworld?" "No," he said. "Gillian." Beryl caught her breath. "Underdogs," Horth tried to clarify. The qualification did not seem to matter to Beryl. "Such things happen to children on Gillian?" she cried in a shrill voice, and then fled from him. Horth took a step towards the door and stopped when he saw her run into Lywolf's arms, sobbing. Falk came in, confiscated the silver box from Horth's dresser, and said, "I will see that this is brought to Zersarn's attention." Horth shook his head. "My father," he said. "Liege Nersal." "And the Liege of Nersal as well, naturally," Falk assured him. Horth paced about his room for long minutes after they had left, before deciding that he had to see his father himself. A Nersalian honor guard stopped him outside the main house where Hangst was living. He contemplated challenging their captain. It was much more straightforward with fellow highborns than it was with the noble-born honor guard, who ought to yield automatically in theory, but often chose to claim they were empowered to act, en masse, on behalf of a highborn liege. But Horth did not want to kill or be killed over whether he saw Hangst now or later. Instead, he went back to his room to wait for Hangst to summon him. Kiga Tark brought his breakfast tray the next morning, instead of the servant Horth had sent to fetch it for him. "What's the matter?" she asked, putting the tray down. "Don't like eating with the rest of us?" "Nessaks," Horth tried to explain his discomfort. Kiga shrugged sturdy shoulders. "You get used to them." Horth was glad to see Kiga. Their encounter at Den Eva's 3 years earlier qualified her as a Shast. He assumed that was why she had substituted herself for the servant he sent to fetch him breakfast, and she proved him right. The physical comfort of sex was welcome. But afterwards, She indulged in conjectures about the Rishan box. Amel is pathetic, of course, but he is Sevolite for all that, she said, offended. And Rishans are commoners. This point seemed to bother Kiga. Of course, Amel is, she continued, some sort of Demish icon, in fact. A kind of Zerpol for those guilty of the pole error. Maybe the insult is intended for the Okal lumens and not for all Seveldom. Something about her analysis bothered Horth, but he didn't realize until after she was gone that it was her matter-of-fact reference to one of the Nessak errors. He wasn't sure how to put his discomfort into words the next time she visited. He also found out Kiga had been promoted. She was no longer an Abshah, like Horth, but a command officer on a battle wheel and entitled to the military title of Imshah. That placed her firmly on the career path Horth coveted, and he did not want to make a bad impression. It was 6 days before Horth saw his father. He passed his time watching Eller and their sisters from a distance, or training from time to time with Lywolf, who assured him that Beryl was as well as could be expected the given difficulty she was having with her latest pregnancy, which obliged her to rest often. "Your mother is distressed because she does not want to return to Gileon," Lywolf told him. "But we must go back to Gileon to satisfy the Kemstan. Many won't renew their oaths while your father keeps his back turned to the Green and Red Vrelish, and we cannot begin unification by fighting those who should be allies. On that point, we are all of one mind. What we do about the Rishans, we will do together." The next day, Horth had unexpected visitors. He had gone for a long run that morning, then returned feeling empty of anxieties to do with Rishans. A woman in a plain, full-length dress of grey wool leaped to her feet from a stone bench outside his guest suite as he came around the corner. It took Horth a moment to recognize Kale from Sarnhaven. Zerhen came jogging back from where he had been taking tea with Berylin and 2 other girls dressed up in clothes that were too big for them. Kale looked strong but careworn, with tension in her brow and a downward bias about her mouth as if it were an effort to maintain a neutral expression. "There you are," Zerhen said. "Good, good. Could we come inside?" Reluctantly, Horth let them into his rooms. The servant assigned to him was not there. Horth decided that was just as well. The visitors settled on the couch and chair available in the sitting area while he retrieved his sword from the rack just inside the door and strapped it on over his jogging clothes. He wasn't quite sure why he did that, since neither Kale nor Zerhen were what the Nessaks would call warriors, but it felt right to him somehow. "We've come a long way to see you," Zerhen stated the obvious. Horth waited. "We heard you were here, you see," the priest went on. "When word came about the Rishan abomination." Horth was starting to feel concerned about Kale's subdued behavior, and was worried he was going to get blamed for having sex with her before he left, even though, as he remembered, it had definitely been her idea. As far as Eagle Nest was concerned, he had no doubt he had done the right thing, and it had been impossible for him to go back to Sanhome after. Zerhen stood up, uncomfortable sitting while Horth loomed over him and his female charge. Kale stayed seated, her eyes downcast. "The thing is, Horth," Zerhen rambled on, the way some people will when confronted by silence. "Our Kale here has had a bad time of it. She told us, in the end, what happened in the pantry before you left." Horth saw Kale tense, as if passionate indiscretion had haunted her ever since, like an angry ghost. That bothered him. "There she was," Zerhen continued, "living in the house that had taken you in, living with Hill's grieving widow." Zerhen failed to overcome his own grief on that score, and felt driven to add, "Hill praised you so, Horth, for your showing at the capital. He liked you." Zerhen shook his head, making his cheeks wobble. "It is hard to understand." "Akrel," Horth said bluntly. "I liked Hill too." Kale looked up. Zerhen froze. The priest wet his lips and fidgeted. "I had reservations myself, you know. If it had been a planet, of course, out of the question. But the Zerstan, and the only residents, all non-eternals." Zerhen broke off and straightened up. "But we aren't here to dwell on the Eagle Nest incident. We are here to find out if you'll honor your promise to marry. It is Kale's wish." She finds it hard to live among us now, under the circumstances. But with unification coming, the family felt it was worth finding out if she could be one of you." When Zerhen stopped, Horth put a hand on his back and pushed him steadily but firmly out the door. The priest resisted at first, calling, "Kale, will you be all right, Kale?" over his shoulder, but when she did not answer, he let himself be mastered rather than oblige Horth to get forceful. Horth found Kale on her feet when he came back from the chore. She was looking at him frankly. He preferred that, and rewarded her with a grin. Then, he pulled her down on the couch beside him, hindered by the sword he had put on, and held both her hands. Kale's face was animated by a disturbing amalgam of fear and hope. Horth looked straight into her eyes and said, "No." The hope and fear collapsed with a jolt. "You won't marry me?" she got out in 2 disconnected gasps. "No." Kale tried to lurch up. Horth held on. She looked wild for a moment, and Horth thought he would have a fight on his hands. She was too relished to cry. He said, "Fly with me." What? Horth stood up, drawing her up after him. "Now." He led her step by wooden step out of his rooms. She gave Zerhan a look of stark confusion as they went past, but she did not ask him for rescue, and the mild-mannered priest let them go. Kale was no more dressed for reality skimming than Horth was, in his sweatsuit, but Horth was too impatient to waste time hunting up flight leathers. He marched her out to where his ship was parked, and bundled her into the pilot's seat despite her dress. "I don't know how to fly," she cried, when she realized what he was doing. "Learn," he said, and showed her how. They started with a nasty lurch and nearly hit a parked space-to-orbit shuttle before making it through a very bumpy takeoff. Kale let out a cry of excitement as they pierced the first bank of clouds. Horth taxed his powers of communication to coach her in the minimal piloting skills she would need to control the Rel ship under skim. She had to know at least a little before he dared engage the phase splicer. "I've flown before, of course," she told him, as the moment to begin reality skimming grew closer. "To get here, I mean, as a passenger." He waited for her to raise the immorality of needless trips, but she never broached the subject. When the time came, Horth made Kale take over. She gripped the controls, poised herself, and then hesitated, drawing up her hand to hover over the lever that unleashed the phase splicer, as if it was too hot to touch. "Do you really think I can?" she asked in a crisis of confidence. "I could kill us both, or worse. The lost are not reborn." Horth closed his hand over hers and pulled. Gap washed through them both. It felt like being forced underwater and refusing to strike for the surface. But Horth held back. He felt her grasp their peril. Then, the sound of Kale's wild laughter filled the ship as Kale flew. They very nearly had an accident with a ward ship in the next few seconds, but they made it down to the planet again in the end, without suffering more than an hour's wear and tear and a half-day's time slip. Hanks sent for Horth the day after Kale's first flight. They met in the family's private rooms, in a space that reminded Horth of Blackheart's nursery because, in addition to a comfortable sitting area, it contained a playhouse, a jungle gym, and nerve-cloth toys that could be retrained to change their interface protocols. Eller sat reading in a corner. He looked up when Horth came in, and buried himself all the harder in his book. Berylin was napping on a mattress at the end of the room, curled around a doll. "I did not want to keep you waiting," Hanks told Horth as they sat down. Beryl sat beside her husband, looking drawn. "I understand from another envoy why Brillet was unable to bring me the Retian box herself," Hanks opened, and gave his son a wry smile. "Congratulations, again." Beryl shifted away from Hanks at the mention of Brillet, and picked up her sewing from where she had set it down beside her. Baby Sanal scrammed onto Beryl's lap. Hanks lifted his youngest daughter away from her mother's stomach and put her back down on the floor, saying, "Eller, come entertain your sister." Eller slouched over with a sulky expression. "Do not take Eller's attitude too personally," Hanks told Horth, when the children had moved to the far corner of the room. He has a hard time accepting Zrenal as well. He seems to like Branst well enough, though, Beryl spoke up, and went back to her sewing. She was making a miniature vest, complete with house braid, that was the right size for Berylyn's doll. Eller is a sensitive child, she remarked. Horth can seem a little threatening, that's all. Horth remembered her pleading with Hanks not to take him to the reception for Amel on Fountain Court, and cast a wistful look in Eller's direction at the realization he had been replaced. Horth, Hanks broke the silence. I want your help. Horth nodded. First, Hanks said, you ought to know a few things. Amel is in Killing Reach with Peridor, and apt to stay there for the time being. Deander means to use him as a puppet Ava. Daimon supports his mother, Avrel, as do the Silver Demish. So Killing Reach is full of Demish ships, partly to keep an eye on Amel while Deander negotiates, and partly to make sure the Rishans stay on their side of the jump. Daimon is attempting to maintain communications between the Rishans and the Silver Demish. The Golden Demish, under Prince Deander, are making sure they stay between the Silvers and Amel. They won't move Amel to court until the stakes of the duel concerning him are guaranteed. And who can do that for a dispute between the Demish powers of Fountain Court, except the Vrelish lieges? Daimon needs Black Hearth to pull off any deal. And, as you know, I am not there. So, they are stalemated over the Amel affair, but I am talking to Daimon about how to find out what he knows about the Rishans. And he knows a great deal. He has made a friend of a Rishan named Renar, the same man you saw in the Octagon, I believe. Daimon asked you and Branst to fetch him out of Blue Hearth, along with Daimon's Leica, Eva. Horth said, I remember. Hank sighed. I need to know more than Daimon is telling me about the Rishans. I need to know the jump into their territory. Daimon knows the jump himself, but he won't share it with me. In fact, he is convinced the Demish to stop anyone who tries to hitchhike through with a Rishan pilot. Muscles worked in his father's jaw as he explained his last piece of what he seemed to view as a betrayal on Daimon's part. He inhaled after a pause and squared his broad shoulders. Apparently Amel knows the jump as well, said Hangst. But I may as well wish to learn it from the Golden Emperor. Amel has too many keepers to lay hand on him, so something else must be done. Hangst leaned forward, elbows on his knees and large hands folded quietly. I want the Rishans to stay in Killing Reach, he told Horth. I want them to keep bringing in pilots and building the station they are constructing on our side. I want them here because I need to learn the jump, one way or another. I do not want Rishans knowing how to get into Killing Reach when we do not know how to follow them back out. This made good sense, militarily. It was important to know jumps. Horth nodded. Hank sighed as he sat back. The Silvers would prefer the Rishans went away. I don't blame them. But that solution isn't permanent. It was the one imposed by Amaron 200 years ago, and it has failed. I want to be able to chase the Rishans back into their territory, to establish a base there. That's the only way we can be confident of containing them. What do you want me to do? Asked Horth, slowly and deliberately. Steal the jump? Hank shook his head. No, that's too dangerous. If the Demish warding it don't get you going through, they will get you coming back out. Even if you succeeded, it would start trouble before I'm ready. No, this is what I want, Hangst instructed. I want you to join Branst on the Demish battle wheel named Quicksilver, where he went to be with Tessitat. Daimon makes every pilot arriving from the Rishan side dock there, so he can be sure they are Rishans and police knowledge of the jump. I want you to get a look at them, so we'll know which ones are pilots when the time comes. And I want you to get a good look at the Rishan station up close. I want you to think about it from the point of view of how we'd take one, given that they do not honor sword law, and their stations appear to be more fragile than ours because they have no hull steel. Horth thought about this and found the request reasonable. It was important to be prepared for trouble. Only one thing puzzled him. Branst is there, he said, hoping his father would deduce his question. Already. Hanks nodded. That's why you will be welcome, I hope. But I can't rely on Branst to give me information himself. Branst is our son, he said, taking Beryl's hand as he spoke, and I know that he would never betray us. But I am equally sure that if I asked him to do this for me, he would argue, and he would tell Daimon what I want. Horth nodded and got up. Eller! Beryl cried sharply, and watched as the boy's head rose slowly over the arm of a nearby couch. Were you listening? It doesn't matter, said Hangst. Brance will not be visiting here again before Horth gets back. I don't expect we'll see him until we go back to Black Hearth. Beryl stopped sewing to look at them both. Why, yes, she said, and smiled. We'll all be together there at last. I hadn't thought of that. But she reached for her husband's arm immediately, dread on her face. Why am I so afraid of it then, beloved? Hanks covered her hand with his, keeping an eye on his youngest son. Eller, he cautioned the child. Brance trusts the Monatees more than he should. Do you understand? Yes, father, the boy said, looking miserable. Eller hates the fact we can't all get along, said Beryl. Hanks laughed. I think, he said, you underestimate the Pole side of young Eller's character. Father was probably right about Eller having more Rel about him than Pole, Horth decided, because he caught the 7-year-old trying to stow away on his envoy ship when he left the next morning. Horth had to drag Eller screaming out of the cargo compartment behind the cockpit and hand him to Lywolf. It is wrong to lie, Eller yelled at Horth. It is wrong to lie, especially to brothers. Strange sentiment coming from a master of lies, said Lywolf. Kale was there too. Horth wished he could convince her it was honorable to become McKinstan, even if they couldn't marry. But he hadn't any luck on that front. He had arranged with Kiga to take over Kale's flying lessons, in the hope that Kiga might recruit her as a Rel Shah. Kale gave Horth a wide smile as he got into his envoy. Good weather, she wished him. Fly well. The flight to Killing Reach began to get sticky in Golden Reach. Horth was herded into dock by 3 highborn ships and wasted a whole day waiting for officious Golden Demish functionaries to clear him. By the time it was over, he wished he had taken the chance of ramming through instead of putting up with the intimidation. He hated being bossed around by Goldens. Killing Reach itself offered surprisingly clear weather on the end that connected with Golden Reach. But as he moved across it, towards the jump that led to Rishans, the display of moving Rel ships on his nerve cloth grew alarmingly dense. There were battle wheels everywhere, most with a hand of Rel ships buzzing around them, and some of them Rel skimming themselves at a sedate half-a-skim factor. Now and then, satellite Rel fighters danced signatures to identify themselves. Prowling every access to the Barmy 2 system, where Dander had stashed a Mel, were Golden Demish defenders, while the Silver Demish barricaded the jump itself. The sheer number of ships under skim at any given time made Horth feel like someone walking on thin ice that gave a little with each footfall. It was irrational to have so many ships in the area. Horth located the Quicksilver and very carefully signaled House of Nursal before dropping out of skim to boost himself along by catclawing. He even stopped early and endured more 0G than he wanted to, coasting in without acceleration. Horth, born of Black Hearth and sworn to Liege Brillet, he announced himself when he was hailed on the radio. Here to see Brance Nursal. Horth was more than surprised to be met in the airlock not only by Brance, but also the brown-skinned Rishan named Renar. Horth Nursal, the Rishan greeted him in Gilak, and proceeded to further surprise Horth by using pronouns appropriate for a peer, not a commoner. I did not get a chance to thank you properly on Gillian. It's not an insult, Brance said fast, watching Horth bristle. It's called peerage of convenience. Amaron used it behind closed doors. Daimon thinks it helps with diplomacy. Tessitat fixed Horth with a steady gaze. Who sent you? She asked. Tess, Brance objected to her rudeness. Liege Nursal, said the Rishan, stepping forward. As I understand the situation, he supports our goal of establishing an embassy station on this side of the jump. Please tell him we are grateful. Except for his general good health, Renar was physically unimpressive. But he had an aloof self-possession that Horth did not expect in commoners, unless they were Garroal Pull. And his brown skin made an interesting visual contrast with the rich blue of his tunic and matching slacks. Fine, said Tessitat. You came. Renar said thanks. How about you leave again? What? Branst cried, and rounded on her. Tess, you can't be suspicious of Horth. He's Horth. She inhaled to argue with them, and just tossed her head instead. I wish Daimon were here, she said. I don't, Branst said cheerfully, because then you would have to switch places with him again, and we'd be flying back to Gillian. I want to stay put for a few days. It's common decency, you know, to grant at least a 3-day travel respite. For a highborn, you were such a whiner, Tessitat admonished him. Horth stayed for a full 3-day travel respite, but Tessitat made a point of keeping him away from any Retian pilots. There was always someone keeping an eye on him. But since Tess had no Greenhearth staff with her on the Demish station, she was sometimes forced to let Branst do it. That was how Horth and Branst came to be sparring on the Grand Challenge floor of the Silver Demish battle wheel, directly below the rim docks. The floor underfoot was covered in tightly fitted wood, and the witness stands were hung with drapes that had long silver tassels. When they were finished, they deposited themselves in 2 plush seats up in the stands. Each man pulled off his protective mask, borrowed from Demish lockers, with an almost identical gesture. Branst laughed first, but Horth saw the joke too, and joined him. The Retians think we're crazy to use swords to settle quarrels, Branst volunteered unexpectedly. Why are they still alive? Horth asked what was, to him, the logical follow-up question. They control themselves in other ways, Branst told him. Renar says they use things called arbiters. He says a rogue pilot couldn't make a Retian space station surrender, because the arbiter on board would not accept a threat as a legitimate argument. Isn't that funny? He grinned, then shrugged. I'm not entirely sure of all the details. But the thing is, it's the arbiter that makes them stick to their laws, and their laws say nothing can be taken by force. Nothing. Arbiter? Said Horth. That's right. A kind of living computer. I haven't seen one because they don't have one yet, on Sky Blue Station. But Renar says they look like foggy crystals with faint scintillations moving around inside called the cognitive core, which is alive but doesn't have a personality. He flinched. That part is creepy. Anyway, Retians house them in blocks of the crystal stuff, all around their stations, and talk to them through outlets they call stages. And nothing can intimidate them into doing anything. Branst laughed. I rather like that idea, really. Do they fly? Horth asked, thinking with cold fear of a fleet of soulless Rel ships loosed upon the Empire. Not even as well as a commoner, Branst assured him. The Retians have tried it, apparently, but Gap blanks out an arbiter. They can't make a stitch without disappearing. They don't even make decent passengers except in a sort of embryonic form, or as something called a nav persona, which is a kind of temporary subroutine. Retian pilots fly with what they call subarbitorial crystonics on board. All the same, arbiters are amazing. The Retians depend on them so heavily that they wouldn't know what to do on an average day without their arbiters. I wanted to go see a Retian station that was up and operational, but Tessitat wouldn't let me come. He scowled. She doesn't trust me knowing the jump. But one day, she is really going to trust me. He brightened up. Gives us something to work on, like the next baby. Horth said, and did, nothing to let his brother guess what he had just told him about Tessitat. Days later, back on Tark, Horth struggled through telling his father about arbiters, and that Tessitat Monitum knew the jump into the Retian territories. Hanks took in the information thoughtfully. So did Zersarn, who stood beside him. All Hanks said was, "Thank you." Then there was more waiting, with messengers arriving almost daily from everywhere in the Empire, as well as from San Home. Your father is persuading the Kimpstan to unite with us against the Retians, Wolf told Horth. But they all say the same thing. They will decide on Black Wedge, nowhere else, and not until Brillet is able to stand for them if they decide against your father. Horth could not remember when he had come to realize that unification was going to take place over the conquest of the Retian territories. But he was not immune to the excitement trickling through the ranks of those who gathered about Hangst in hope of favors. Whole planets awaited, people said, with no one to defend them except commoners. Nersalians talked about fields and factories populated by brown-skinned workers, while Nessacs talked about the problems of depopulating their new territory so they could stock them properly with immigrants from San Home. But the worst tensions were over nobleborns, not commoners. One evening, in the great hall where Hank's guests took dinner together, a Nessac shoved a nobleborn. The nobleborn pulled a knife and killed the Nessac. By the time the resulting melee ended, 18 people were dead, and twice that many injured. Horth heard about it the next morning, from the servant who brought his breakfast to his guest suite. Not all interactions were fatal ones, however. Much to Horth's surprise, sex-made inroads where blades failed, in the form of female nobleborns intent on seducing Nessacs to commit the error of debasement. Not every Nessac succumbed to these temptations, but Kale was aghast at how many did, given that every one of them had a wife back on San Home. Nersalian women sobered up after the first dozen found themselves grounded by pregnancies, and business picked up again for male prostitutes in the nearest town, much to every Nessac's apparent disgust, although some of them snuck off to tag along with the Nersalian men who visited the commoner women at such brothels. Horth was beginning to wonder how long they could keep waiting, with Nessacs and Nersalians living in such close quarters, when word of the Zerstan's decision about the Retian box arrived in the person of Okal himself, the Zersis. Every Sevolite at the estate gathered in an outdoor amphitheater to hear the Zersis. Horth was down the front with his family. Even Zrenal was present, although he stayed on the far side of their mother and her younger children. There were also a dozen broadcast crews present, Nersalians being less strict than the Demish about keeping impersonal forms of communication to a minimum. The mood in the amphitheater was expectant. The Zersis represented all souls among the waiting dead. This empowered him to act in the interest of everyone's best hope of rebirth, with special consideration given to the two kinds of great souls, Zerpol and Zerrel. Although why a Zerpol would desire rebirth was beyond Horth. He could not imagine willingly stepping into a life destined to be strewn with shame and defeat, no matter how much he might desire to warn the living through the nastiness of his sacrifice. The whole idea of Zerpol repelled Horth off. He would prefer to take direction from a Zerrel, a strong leader who emerged in troubled times. He thought his father might be a Zerrel. He knew his mother thought so, and he wanted, very badly, to be sure himself. He hoped this might be what Zersis Okal had come to tell him. The Zersis was a tall, thin man, with bony hands and hollow eyes. He opened his arms like a bird of prey, spreading wide a cloak full of symbols. "Nessacs, and no less our cousin Nersalians," the high priest cried in a sonorous voice that filled the air. "Rejoice, for you are lucky to be living in a great age. You are privileged to be the generation to achieve unification." A cheer greeted this opening. Eller jumped up and down excitedly between his younger sisters. Zersis Okal went on to recount the story of the last war, and how it was misguided. Beryl's face glowed as he told the story of her marriage, naming all the children, but dwelling on Zrenal in particular, and how he had become a Nessac warrior. The Zersis moved on to the things that still divided Nersalians from Nessacs. Differences in how women behaved, and differences in how they viewed the non-eternals known as nobleborns. "How then shall we deal with these differences?" asked the Zersis in a voice that mesmerized the audience. "Remember first how Nersal Nessac was lost to his family over a similar question. The Vrelish have souls, he said, and in soul touch it can be proved. But his father would not listen." The Zersis paused. "Now Nersalians tell us there are nobleborns with souls among them. Well," he paused, as if weary. He lifted his head. "Is that strange? Is it impossible? When nobleborns have high-born ancestors?" He raised his hand immediately as the crowd inhaled. "The Zerstan has deliberated, and this is what it has decided. Some nobleborns may have souls. It is possible." Okal let the crowd rumble in a moment before he overcame them once more with his outstretched arms. "Let us unify against the Retians. Let us smash the threat they pose to Okal. Then there will be time to test who has a soul and who does not, through soul touch. But, in the meantime, let it be proclaimed that it is possible." A murmur of indecision stirred the audience. Quickly, Okal progressed to the next challenge. "Narsalian women," Okal cried, "are relish women. They struggle, in this life, to be redeemed. Many men among the Nesak struggle as well. We rebuke them, yes, but they are still members of our family. Let us not dwell on differences such as these. And let us not forget that San Home's founder, San Nersal, was the greatest warrior of her day, although, of course, she honored marriage in the Nesak fashion." This time, the crowd's restlessness was punctuated by laughter and a few jeers. Okal raised his voice again, stilling the restless among them. "Enough of differences. Let me speak about a thing that unites us. A terrible thing, and a thing of beauty. The Zerstan has consulted and declared that we live in a time of dire threat to Okal. Rishans have Lorel technologies, able to steal the memories from a living mind, and they have used them on a Sevalite. But what is this boy, this lost Prince Amel, who the Okal lumens in their misguided usage term a soul of light? What is he but—" Okal broke off, as if he had arrived too fast at his conclusion. He gave a sort of laugh, a sound like grief, but rich with love. "It moves me to tell you the thing that I must tell you," Okal said. "It moves me with elation for the gift of suffering, the gift that instructs by its sacrifice. It moves me to fear as well, fear that this gift, this suffering, will not be enough to move us, that it will be wasted. Fear that you may not believe, as I do." He strafed the group in front of him with his stare. "Amel was mind-raped by the Rishans, and his suffering spewed across the universe by them. Amel is called the Soul of Light by Okal lumens, or at least those with enough courage to contemplate the horror of so much suffering befalling someone so gentle, so compassionate, so—" "Pull!" Falk shouted in a hard bark from just behind Beryl. "Zerpol!" Others took up the cry, here and there. Suddenly, there was shouting all around Horth, a tidal wave of voices merging into one chant. "Zerpol! Amel! Zerpol! Amel!" Horth looked at his father. Hanks looked back at him, untouched by the hysteria surrounding them. He detached himself from Beryl and moved behind the family to reach Horth. He touched Horth's back. Horth leaned towards him to hear, above the shouting, what his father said. And in Hank's deep voice, with its ripple of humor, Horth heard distinctly, "Whatever works." Horth was moved and excited to be included in his father's war council on the eve of their departure for Fountain Court. The meeting took place in a small stately room above Hank's living quarters. The walls were wood-lined, and the table at the center was made of the same stuff. Guerrero Pull oversaw security, scanning guests discreetly for any undesirable technology, and the guards of honor at the door were highborns. Horth joined a group of Imshah waiting for Hanks to convene the meeting. Kiga was there, and half a dozen other commanders, both Nesak and Nersalian. Horth was the only Avshah in attendance. He felt his junior status all the more acutely when Zrenal appeared, dressed in the uniform of a Nesak arm commander in charge of 3 battle wheels. Zrenal spared his younger brother a single smug smile and made a point of socializing with his military rank peers. Hanks got the meeting started by hanging his sword belt on a peg along one wall. Everyone else did likewise. Then they seated themselves around the table. 4 of the 12 people present were women, and the rest men. The imbalance gave Horth a faint feeling of uneasiness, but he told himself it was only to be expected when half the people in the room were Nesaks. He counted Zrenal in that number. "Horth is here as Brillet's representative," Hanks explained, noting the looks cast in Horth's direction. Kiga caught Horth's eye and winked at him, earning a disapproving look from the Nesak across from her. She either did not notice or did not care. These are the issues. Hanks got the War Council off to a brisk start. First, we must know the jump into the Rishan territories. Brillet's people have been looking for stray Rishan renegades in Killing Reach, but so have others, it would seem. The supply has dried up. I have delegated Imshaz Renal the task of arranging for a Nessak priest to steal the jump. The Nessaks have also claimed responsibility for a backup plan in case the priest fails. So, we will count that problem solved. The second problem, said Hangst, is a harder one. My son Horth brought me information about Rishan stations that I have since confirmed through other channels. First, unlike Hull Steel stations, Rishan stations will crack almost immediately if anti-personnel tactics are employed against them. Second, Rishan command is mediated by a machine that will not make deals. We could win hands down and still be denied dock. Apparently, we could even achieve occupation and not gain control but be treated by this thing the Rishans call an arbiter, like mere criminals. Kiga leaned forward on an elbow. From what you related of Horth's intelligence, my liege, she addressed Hangst, these arbiters have an even weaker grip than commoners. Might even the slightest bit of shaking solve the problem? Disable the arbiter? Hangst said, and frowned. Possibly, but only at the risk of cracking at least some of the stations they inhabit. And even if we did succeed, it is unclear that Rishans will behave like ordinary commoners. My information comes to me indirectly, via contacts I still have on Gileon, but Daimon thinks that Rishan stations can't be captured. One of the Nessaks said bluntly, Then we take the stations out, all of them, make them dust. That will make for bad weather, cried Zrenal, straightening up as if stung. Everyone looked at him. I mean, Zrenal continued, wouldn't it be better just to crack them gently enough they break into big pieces? Dust is, well, it's dust. You can't fly through dust. And it spreads out. I believe we are all familiar with the navigational hazards, said Hangst in a tight tone. Is there any other objection? No one spoke. Kiga fidgeted. Most of the other Nessalians and one of the Nessaks looked uncomfortable. Horth found his voice without knowing he was going to speak until he did. It is Okal. Yes, it is Okal, said Hangst, and relaxed. A babble of voices ensued, with everyone speaking for or against station-cracking tactics without listening to what the other said. Hank stood up, wide-shouldered, large, and angry. Enough, he cried. The War Council fell silent. Hank sat down again. Other ideas? He invited. Not Hull Steel, said Horth. Punch holes. Hanks gave him a rare smile. Yes, the fact their stations aren't Hull Steel makes that possible. But Aurel Shah are not trained for tactics like those. They would require an assault force working out of Skim in 0G, inside the station's challenge sphere, and possibly under fire from lightspeed defense weapons, if the Rishans use them. Lacking Hull Steel to protect themselves, they well might. They did 200 years ago in Killing Reach. Use Nersalian commoners, Horth said. A Nessak got up, stiffly. To arm the soulless Hanks Nersal is to empower short-sighted destruction. No, not even to conquer the Rishans. It is better to destroy their stations utterly. Hanks leaned forward. Better to crack stations and risk planets, is that it? He asked the Nessak. Are you prepared to stake your soul's next rebirth on it, Franklin? The Nessak arm commander addressed as Franklin drew himself up. I will send to the Zerstan back on San Home for an answer. Zersisakal himself can take it to them. We will bring their judgment to you, on found in court. But whatever answer they return, you had better be prepared to decide if you want unification as much as you would like to make us think. The Nessak and his following extracted themselves from the table and left. Zrenal looked at his father anxiously for direction. Hangst waved at him to leave, and he did, with a grateful expression. Soon, only the Nessalians remained. Kiga turned to Horth. What does Liege Brillet say? Is it right to crack stations when the inhabitants are Okal? Brillet will come to Fountain Court, Hangst answered in Horth's place. She is my first sworn and my named heir. She has Nessak blood, like most Nersalians, but she is everything the Kimstan honor. A warrior, a breeder, an Imshah, and an old sword whose reputation is without flaw. A veteran of the Nessak War herself, and the one who knows better than most what kind of mess the Rishans leave behind them, and the corruption they spread. I will make my decision, and Brillet will endorse or condemn it there. Hanks got up, signaling the end of the meeting. People began to leave swiftly. Hangst raised his head and called, "Horth, stay." Horth walked back to join his father. Hangst straightened and smiled, looking less burdened. "I have a commission to offer you," he said. "A battle wheel, the Dragon Son. One of the 3 in my arm. I would like you to captain her. I'll discuss it with Brillet, naturally. I know you were sworn to her. But we are about to have a swearing at which that could change." Hank smiled broadly. "Will you fly with me into this Rishan hell?" Horth had not hoped for so much so suddenly. He was sure his face said all he felt, because his father laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "I'll take that as a yes," Hank said, and laughed again. He went to collect their sword belts from the rack on the wall. "Of course," Hanks added, handing Horth's sword to him, "we'll have to find you some noble-born orderlies who can learn to interpret your silences." He laughed again in a lighter way, and put his palm on the middle of Horth's back. "In the meantime, start eating with us. And if Eller is rude, just sit on him." That was Brand's solution. Daimon danced a code. Dot, dash, dash, dot. Dash, dot, dot, dash. The Demish ship shimmered back. If there was one thing the Demish could be trusted for, it was observing protocols, no matter how complicated. A Vrelish blockade would never have lasted this long, let alone put up with passcodes that required them to memorize a rotating schedule of transformations. Daimon could make his point now without fear of starting a shake-up. He had identified himself as part of their blockade. He flew in a broad arc, watching for the Rishan ship he stalked to commit to the jump. Then, Daimon dove at a punishing 6 skimfax. He braked just as hard to match Mix with his prey as they plunged into the jump with the Rishan, feeling the man's alarm and soul touch. Daimon knew the killing jump. The Monatees had known it for 200 years, although they never made it except to teach new members of the ruling family. But if he had not known the jump, he could have learned it just now. This was the lesson he was trying to teach his reluctant pupil. Sevelites could steal jumps, and even the bravest pilots found it nearly impossible to choose instead, to sacrifice themselves to oblivion. Instinct lay at the root of making jumps successfully, and instinct argued for survival. Daimon and his reluctant student burst out together on the far side in the reach of paradise. Daimon executed a solar flare maneuver to be sure the Rishan registered his presence, then dove right back into the jump to re-emerge in killing reach. As soon as Daimon's ship reappeared through the jump, he attracted ward ships that were following his own directions to be wary of unscheduled arrivals. Even his shimmer-danced password did not reassure them entirely. A couple dropped out of skim to dog him in real space when he made the transition. The ward ships didn't let him dock until he'd wasted 15 minutes explaining his actions by radio, time he especially resented for the sake of his additional exposure to low Gs. He was far from in a good mood when he finally docked and left his Rel ship. Quicksilver's grand challenge floor lay between the rim dock Daimon favored and the quarters he and Tessitat had been allocated. Their rooms served as a sort of green hearth embassy for the duration of the blockade, although the two of them were seldom present at the same time. One had to be at court as much as possible. The Demish had rolled out a high-traffic carpet to protect the challenge floor, and locked up the fencing gear as well, after Brance Nersal's sparring bout with his brother. Apparently, Demish cooperation did not extend to damaging the plush sheets or scuffing the wood inlay on the challenge floor. But it wasn't the Demish who were irritating Daimon the most today. His little demonstration of jump stealing was an act of desperation to make the Rishans see they shouldn't be here. Renar was waiting for him near the far end of the challenge floor. "Do you feel better now?" the Rishan asked, in a tone more like that of a perplexed parent than a suitably impressed commoner. Daimon halted, ground his teeth, and waited until he could draw a steady breath before retaliating. "Do you feel safe?" he demanded. Renar sighed. "I told you, we don't put ourselves at risk by being here. But what is the alternative? Waiting on the other side of the jump, in ignorance?" "Yes," Daimon exclaimed. "Because every day you stay here, you risk starting a shakeup that will do untold harm." "The build-up out here is about Amel, not us," Renar insisted. "Why don't you go convince Ander to transport Amel to Gillian and settle things the way you want?" "I can't," Daimon said bitterly. Renar relented. "Yes," he said with sympathy, "I know. You can't resolve the conflict over Amel because the Goldens and the Silvers do not trust each other enough. You need your friend, Legionnaire Sal, back on Fountain Court to reassure them both that the challenge will be fairly fought." Renar touched Daimon's arm. "I do understand it complicates things for you to have us around. But just like you, there are things that I can do out of friendship and things that I cannot. We are here because we have to know what's going on. Knowledge is as basic to our culture as honor is to yours. Rishans will never trade safety for ignorance." Daimon met the Rishan's eyes directly. "But you yourself," he said, "could go home." Silence greeted the suggestion. In English, the question of whether or not to address Renar in peerage was moot. But this also made it annoyingly easy for the conversation to feel personal. And Renar mattered too much to Daimon. Particularly since Hangst had left Fountain Court, Daimon had been starved for the kind of company he found in Renar. A willingness to entertain ideas and perfect trust. But that was not the worst. He loved the stubborn Rishan man, in a way that he could never have dared love his Vrelish peer on Fountain Court. Daimon wanted very much to stuff the Rishan in a ship and fly him home. But Renar had made him promise to obtain his consent for even protective gestures, and somehow, the Rishan managed to extract such promises in a way that committed every fiber of Daimon's personal honor. Daimon said, "Renar, I don't know what to do." "I know," the Rishan said. "I'm not sure either." They were interrupted by Brance Nersal, dressed in flight leathers, who came charging in from the rear end of the challenge floor nearest the docks. "It's happening!" Brance exclaimed in Gilak as Daimon was turning around. Brance crossed the floor at a run and grabbed Daimon's forearms. "You have to do something. Father is summoning the Kimpstan to court for swearing. He is going to ask for their support to take out the Rishans, with the help of the Nessaks." Brance paused to catch his breath and swallow. "Father thinks he can work with the Nessaks. He's won concessions, tolerance for female warriors, a gesture in the direction of nobleborns being redeemable." Brance was shaking with outrage all at once. "Redeemable! Tolerance!" His eyes filled up with tears. "I can't believe my father can accept that." Daimon detached Brance from him. "Sometimes," he said, "people risk too much to keep what they love." "Mother?" Brance asked painfully. Then he rallied. "Then why doesn't he protect her from Zer Sarn? Sarn is making her crazy, talking as if what's happened to Amel could happen to Eller, Berylin, and Sanel if she doesn't convince father to do whatever Zer Sarn wants him to do next." "I do not believe," Daimon said, with a heavy feeling of unwelcome truth, "that your father can be led anywhere he does not want to go, even by your mother's influence. Or that he can wean your mother from Sarn. Your parents matter to each other. But they act out of their own deep motives. Hangst a forge of relish power able to overthrow the Demish court, and Beryl to unite Nersalians and Nessaks in one great cause." Daimon sighed. "The tragedy is that the two have come to overlap, and that, I fear, is my fault." Renar raised a hand to touch Daimon's arm, making him flinch away with a look of thunderous affront. Had the Rishan no sense to betray familiarity like that in front of Brance? Brance missed any suggestion of intimacy in the aborted act. He said instead with grim humor, "You could lose a hand that way, Rishan, or worse." "Yes," Renar said awkwardly, realizing his own mistake. "Of course." He did not even bother to assert peerage of convenience by correcting Brant's choice of pronouns in Gilak. "I cannot return to court now," Daimon decided on the spot. "Even if I did, there is nothing I could do but observe, and Tessitat should already be there by now to witness for Green Hearth." "What of you, Branst?" Daimon asked, careful to maintain a neutral tone. "You are Kimp Stan. Will you heed the summons?" Branst looked torn. I have to," he stammered. "But you have to talk to Dad. He listens to you." Daimon shook his head grimly. "Not anymore." "But—" "Branst!" Daimon snapped with a flare of impatience that showed the red depths of his anger. He gritted his teeth, mustering self-control. "I have been outmaneuvered. There is nothing I can do. I know your father's long-term agenda. But in the short term, he has bought the Demish by promising to ensure a fair outcome in the duel brewing between the Silvers and the Goldens over Amel, which is really over the throne. He asked in return that they refrain from barricading the killing jump, which is how the Silver Demish and I prefer to solve the Rishan problem. And the Rishans have not helped by refusing to go home." "Contact is inevitable one way or—" Renar began, and was silenced by Daimon's raised palm. "You know what Hangst wants the Rishans here for, don't you, Branst?" Daimon asked. "You know why he sent Horth here, too. To learn the Rishans' weaknesses, and how to gain the jump. Would that I knew what intelligence he took back." "No," Branst protested with vehemence. "Not Horth. Horth is honorable." Daimon sighed, but he liked the young man despite his foolish hopes. "Hangst can offer your brother everything he wants," explained Daimon. "Sometimes, when there is that much to be gained, all honor requires is an excuse." "No!" exclaimed Branst. He shook his head. "You don't know. You don't understand us as well as you think you do." "Us?" Daimon asked mildly. "And who do you mean by us? You and your brother? Your family? The Kimp Stan? Or all Nersalians, perhaps? Where exactly does honor reside?" "Brillet will stop it," Brant said adamantly, and nearly choked as he realized he was willing her to challenge his father. Daimon said, "Perhaps." He had never imagined he would be hoping for Hangst to lose a challenge. Brant tore away from them, heading back to the dock where he'd left his ship, one level up. "Branst!" Daimon shouted after him. "Rest a day before you fly." But it was no use. Daimon turned back to Renar, hoping his Rishan confidant had grasped the gravity of his people's situation at last. But Renar looked as stubborn as ever. "They cannot attack us on our own territory as long as they do not know the jump." Daimon opened his mouth to remind the Rishan of his little demonstration, but just closed it again. "Inevitable," Renar would say. Contact was inevitable. Rishans would not hide or wait for it to happen on someone else's terms. Instead, Renar surprised him by adding, "But I'll get on the radio and see what I can do to convince them to evacuate non-essential personnel." Renar had been trying, unsuccessfully, for 2 hours when an arm of Nessak battle wheels showed up, eliminating the possibility. Quicksilver's captain, Prince Han, greeted Daimon's arrival on the bridge with a frosty look. "We have no orders to fight in the defense of the Rishans," he reminded Daimon. "If any fighting starts, we'll pull back." "I understand," Daimon said automatically, and turned his back. Beyond the communications console, a composite image loomed on a panoramic nerve cloth screen. One layer showed the deployment of stationary objects, including the killing jump. Another showed the last reported locations and trajectories of rel-skimming wardships. Since that data could be collected only under skim, it was necessarily out of date. A number in one corner of the screen changed from 30 minutes to 10 as Daimon watched, indicating a change in the update interval. Prince Han's wardships had to drop out of skim more often to communicate with the stationary Quicksilver. A typical Demish decision, Daimon thought, trading flexibility of response for more information. He added dourly under his breath. They ought to get on well with the Rishans. So far, the Nesak commander has done no more than deploy wardships with due notice and consideration for other traffic in the area, said Prince Han, stuffily, as if 3 polite Nesak warships were far better company than a handful of relish visitors who scuffed up Quicksilver's challenge floor. Daimon displaced the officer at the comm station to open an internal channel to Renar, who was back in his embassy rooms. We have Nesaks on watch for an opportunity to steal the jump, he informed the Rishan. Let your people know not to send any pilots across, starting now. It's too late, Renar said. We have one en route, taking the question of withdrawing back to sync with the Arbiter Net, for a broader vote. Daimon cursed under his breath. Then, despite the impossibility of the timing, he bolted for the docks. Security was tight on Gillian. The new Ava of Rel, installed by Daimon, had Palace Arents and Throne Garibal out in force. That was partly due to feelings running high over Amel in all directions, but it was also due to Hank's proposal of a war alliance to subdue the Rishans. Ava of Rel had declared the question of unification a Nersalian affair, and wished it settled as expediently as possible so that the Demish could get on with the duel over custody of her son. She had, however, made a point of disagreeing with Zer Sisakal's proclamation that Amel was a Zer Pol. The inner circle of the Golden Demish reserved judgment on Amel being a soul of light as well. One way or the other, the talk in highborn receptions was of little else but Amel, while in less privileged quarters of Under Gillian, people united in a show of righteous passion in support of Okal Rel. From the meanest commoner on the Palace Plain, where terrible memories of Lorel plague still harvested lives and children's nightmares, to noble-born Demish families whose plans for increasing their riches were threatened by the thought of fouled space lanes. The population of Gillian stood firm in opposition to the willful disregard that people could inflict on less important ones by waging war. People greeted each other with Okal Rel, like a prayer. Gangs raided freeholds run by people rumored to be non-believers. Self-declared clear dreamers, able to remember past lives, got up in public places to proclaim cautionary tales in which those who violated Okal Rel were denied rebirth into the world they had seen fit to damage to gain their ends. Settle by sword law, the people of Gillian demanded of their betters, or be damned. They wanted no space wars within the Empire. What happened at the edge of the Empire, with Rishans, they found harder to understand. Many thought conflict should be cut off again, as it had been 200 years ago, while others liked the idea of quick extermination before something catastrophic went wrong, and questions were asked about why the Monatees appeared to like the Rishans. One day on Gillian was enough for Horth. He chose to wait in orbit instead on his new battle wheel. Kale was assigned as a cadet on its sister ship, the Dragon Daughter, and visited Horth a few times. He was glad to see her doing well as a Nersalian woman, even if she remained stubbornly Nesak about sex. Her appreciation of his new status as captain was more gratifying. She wanted to know everything he could tell her about it. Dragonsword was the flagship of the trio. When the swearing was done, Hanks would take command of it himself. The day before the swearing, Horth found Brillet in his quarters. I guess I should have offered you a battle wheel sooner, she remarked on his good fortune. But it's just as well. You and I are much too fortunate a combination for the waiting dead. The child? He asked. A fine girl, she told the sire. Dorn is very pleased with her. Horth grinned back. It was likely to be the most direct chance he would have to bask in paternal feelings towards the second child by Brillet, so he made the most of it. But he was less happy about the suggestion that their sexual relationship was going to end. Brillet sat down at his table and pulled over a disk of snacks. You are still my vassal until tomorrow's swearing, however, she told him. So tell me, what is Hanks playing at with this unification idea? Her uncharitable tone gave Horth a chill. He did not like to think that she and Hanks might disagree. He knew all too well what that would mean. Reluctantly, Horth sat down opposite her. I do not explain well, he said. Brillet waved a protein stick in his direction. Exactly why I need to know what you think. Tell me straight. What's the worst we're looking at here? Deaths, Hort said. Many of them. Rations? Brillet remarked, around a mouthful she was chewing. Rations, he confirmed, and the stations they live on. But it is not necessary, he added, surprising himself. Oh? She encouraged him. Horth began to get excited, and felt relieved of a burden at the same time. He could tell Brillet what he had been thinking but unable until now to put into words. She would tell Hanks when they met before the swearing. No need to crack stations, Horth told Brillet. Isolate them instead. No Sevelites to duel. He acknowledged the drawback. Gain surrender with food, other necessities. He shook his head. The ideas were coming out more jumbled than he meant, and Brillet was frowning at him. If only he could explain properly. He knew that force was necessary to control the Okal, and he saw nothing wrong in those who took the risk of stopping them being the ones to gain territory in exchange. But he was disturbed by the idea of cracking stations, even if the inhabitants were Rishans. Okal Rel endorsed war against leaders, not people. Even more significantly, he did not see how they could ever teach the Rishans to live within the limitations set by Okal Rel if they started by breaking their own laws to conquer them. The Nersalians and Nessaks ought to use their strength to gain control instead and work on more difficult problems from a position of moral strength. Desperate to convey all that in words, Horth tried again. Cracking stations is Okal, he said. Still frowning, Brillet nodded. I share your discomfort there, she said. I wish I knew more about the Zerpol, Amel. Not a Zerpol, Horth insisted. Just Pol. Put that way, being Pol was an insult, not something that elevated vulnerability to a higher plane. Horth was sick of all the talk about Amel. If he isn't a Zerpol, Brillet said in a hard voice, then we could be about to imperil our souls. She did understand, Horth decided, and she would explain it to his father. He got up, feeling reassured there would be no station cracking now, however the Zerstan ruled on it. Daimon was not in time to stop the Nessak going through the jump with the Rishan pilot, but he was in time to see 3 Demish pursuers balk shy of a jump they did not know. Maybe I should signal them to follow me, Daimon thought, and then rejected the idea. The Demish set like concrete once they took over anything. And however little they wanted to do with the Rishans right now, Daimon feared to put temptation in their path. He took the jump alone and emerged on the Rishan side in clear space, in the reach of paradise. Nothing but a faint flicker of skim activity registered between Daimon and the station named Second Contact, the original base of Renar's mission. There were no wardships visible, but Renar had assured him the Rishans didn't use them. They used a medical technology related to the one they used to extract memories from Amel, which was able to ensure that all pilots were trustworthy before they got into a Rel ship. The idea raised hairs on the back of Daimon's neck, but according to Renar, it worked. No wardships, however, meant no outlying ships to communicate with via shimmer dances, and no way to know what to do next. And where were the Nessak and the Rishan pilot he had followed? It was situations like this that could make reality-skimming situations so maddening. Daimon was fairly sure he had not time-skipped. So he decided the Rishan and his Nessak hitchhiker must have, and would shortly emerge. Unless they were lost. The problem was how long to wait, and what to do while he did. 2 dim Rel ships appeared after a few minutes, coming towards him from Second Contact Station. Their faint wake signatures tallied with them being commoners, probably sent out to investigate. Brave, Daimon thought with grudging respect. Or stupid. Probably both, he decided, thinking of Renar. He forgot the Rishans the next instant, as the Nessak and his prey tumbled out of the jump together. The Rishan pilot promptly jumped out of sight on Rel telemetry. Daimon went for the Nessak. He caught him with a flyby before the hitchhiker got oriented, and then coiled around and went for a wake lock with his next pass. The resulting soul touch was illuminating. The Nesak was a Zer and a strong pilot, but he had been entirely unprepared to experience soul touch with a commoner. His faith was perturbed, and with it, his self-possession. Daimon took control of both their vessels, through the wake lock, and hit the Nesak with as much gap as he felt as his own convictions could weather without leaving him too badly stunned. To Daimon's elation, the Nesak dropped out of skim like a wounded squirrel, dropped by an avian predator of native Monetese origins upon discovering it did not like the taste of Earth-derived blood. What to do next was a problem. Fishing for ships in real space under skim was like trying to find a dropped coin in an ocean. If the Nesak wasn't dead, he was out of Daimon's reach for the moment. But he couldn't go anywhere without betraying himself either. And if Daimon got lucky, he might wipe him out with a close flyby without even knowing it. Colliding with the becalmed Nesak during in-phase manifestation would be a whole lot uglier, but Daimon would have to be astronomically unlucky to do that, even if he crisscrossed the area trying to pick up the tiny point of mass during in-phase sampling. Daimon was circling, watching for his prey to bolt, when he realized the Rishans from Second Contact Station had their own ideas. Fascinated, but unable to communicate without shared shimmer codes, Daimon watched as the Rishans came on steadily. Whatever they were doing seemed to take forever, in part because they dropped out of skim from time to time themselves. He decided they must be using sensors that depended on being in real space to detect the becalmed ships. They certainly did not seem to be prepared to stop because of Daimon's presence, however alarmingly he must have registered on their own REL telemetry equipment. Finally, the Rishan ship split up to go after the Rishan pilot and the Nesak one. Daimon watched the one headed for the area where the Nesak had dropped out of skim, searching his memory for anything Renar might have told him when he wasn't quite listening about how Rishans conducted themselves in space. He retrieved the idea of an ambulance ship, with pilot and crew able to work in both skim and 0G, and with a hold big enough to swallow a 1 or 2 person REL ship. When the ambulance ship near the Nesak disappeared, Daimon made up his mind and dropped out of skim to communicate, bracing himself for the unpleasantness of 0G. Rishans, he hailed them in their language, learned from Renar, feeling mildly foolish not to have a better salutation ready. "This is Daimon, liege Monitum. The pilot you are retrieving is my prisoner. You will take him through the jump back into Killing Reach and dock with the Quicksilver over there." A frustrating silence followed. Then, a female voice answered. "We are a medical rescue ship, liege Monitum. Forgive me if I don't know how to talk to you, I'm not an anthropologist. Our mandate is to return to second contact with anyone requiring our help. We are not authorized to surrender any patient, especially not to someone with, to someone calling him a prisoner." Daimon gritted his teeth, allowing himself the pleasure of imagining for an unworthy moment a joint strike force of Nesaks and Nersalians sweeping Rishan pilots out of space. "REL-capable ships do not carry arbiters," he told the Rishans, to prove he knew something about them. "You can make up your own minds." There was a pregnant pause. Then a second voice cut in, belligerent and male. "You misunderstood our chief medic, I think," the voice said. "What she meant to say was, we don't take orders from Gilax, is that clearer?" Gods, Daimon thought, give me patience. He was barely able to stand 0G as it was, even without the rising blood pressure this pointless banter was causing him. Red blotches danced before his eyes. "Get through that jump ahead of me," Daimon ground out over the radio. "Or stay here and be shattered with the creature you are sheltering. That is your choice, nothing else." He didn't wait for an answer. He couldn't stand a moment more of 0G. He boosted to skim and tightly circled around the Rishans, waiting for them to appear on his nerve cloth as a REL-skimming ship again. Much to his fury, they did not oblige him immediately. It was hours later when Daimon joined Renar at the embassy suite on Quicksilver, after checking to make sure his Demish hosts had the Nesak Zer he'd captured locked up securely in their brig. The 2 medical Rishans from the battered ambulance were resting on Daimon's bed, one male and one female. Both were dressed in blue uniforms and slack on the clinomen administered by the Demish as a first-aid measure. The Retian pilot lurched out of the chair where Renar had been administering to his nosebleed. The pilot's eyes were bloodshot. His face was darker than Renar's and his hair was fuzzier. He was also a larger, more strongly built man, as tall as Daimon. "You Sevolite primitive!" the pilot shouted, fisting his hands in rage. "I'll kill you!" "Don't say that," Renar urged, getting between them with the bloody cloth he had been using still in one hand. "He'll take you seriously." "Well, he should," raged the Retian pilot, and was forced to pause to snort blood. "There is more blood than a broken blood vessel," Renar worried. "He's also coughing blood." "We've got bigger problems," Daimon told him coldly. The big Retian pilot shoved Renar to one side and swung a fist like a mallet at Daimon's head. Daimon swiveled, snatched the commoner's arm at the wrist as it shot past, and backhanded him across the jaw with his other hand. It felt much, much too good, watching the Retian go down. "Will you stop that?" Renar shouted, losing his temper. "Law and reason, Mon. You've already done these people serious harm." "You look after them then," Daimon shouted back. "I have things to do." When Daimon got to the bridge of the Quicksilver, he went over to the comm station and ordered, "Get me the Nesak commander." Prince Han was in the captain's chair at the center of the circular room. He bristled at his visiting dignitary's presumptions, but something about Daimon's demeanor made him give up and confirm the order with a nod instead. "Remember, we are not getting into a shake-up with those battle wheels for you," Prince Han reminded Daimon. "Strangely," Daimon said, "I haven't forgotten." Zrenal Nursal appeared on the comm screen in front of Daimon, giving a shock. But he remembered Zrenal growing up on Fountain Court. "I am not glad to see you here, Liege Monitum," said Hank's son. "I am not glad to see you in a Nesak uniform," said Daimon. "It suits me," Zrenal answered. Daimon said, "I have something that belongs to you. A Nesak. He tried to steal the jump. You may have noticed that the Retians have stopped sending pilots across. That is not an accident. Our liaison here, Renar of Ryer, convinced them it was unwise, at last. And the Demish have taken any pilots left on the unfinished station into their protective custody here. You will have a long, long time to wait if you mean to try to steal the jump again." "Maybe," Zrenal said. "Or I might just be able to persuade you to give Zerkal back." "I can't imagine how," said Daimon. "Because," Zrenal said, "I have someone else with me who knows the jump, and she's being uncooperative, so I think a trade might be desirable for both of us." As he said this, he reached to one side and pulled Tessitat into the picture, looking bruised from hard flying and unsteady on her feet. "Tess!" Daimon gasped. Horth finished dressing for the swearing, and thought of Alice as he noticed a pulled thread in the patterns on his vest. He fingered it slowly, remembering he had not seen her since their return, nor any other servants either. He frowned. It was an unimportant detail at the moment. Beryl appeared at the door of his bedroom holding her latest baby, born just weeks before they arrived. Her haunted look had grown worse since they had moved back to Black Hearth. She kept 4-year-old Berylyn and 8-year-old Eller close to her all the time. She tried to do the same with Sanal, but the 1.5-year-old girl was too relish and agile. Beryl was frequently forced to send Eller after Sanal to collect her. "It will be over soon, won't it?" Beryl asked Horth. Or perhaps she meant to ask the watching dead. Horth could not tell. He saw her draw Berylyn closer against her skirt and wanted to assure her that whatever happened on the Octagon, the children were safe. Nersalians did not kill children. But he could not believe that there was going to be a duel. Brillet shared a fundamental solidarity with Hangst that had survived watching their son, Vren, challenge him and lose. Horth closed his eyes to see if he could grasp why he was thinking about things that seemed irrelevant. Alice was a commoner. She used to live in Black Hearth. She'd been sent away. Vren was Brillet's son by Hangst. He had been Brillet's heir as well. He'd challenged Hangst about his Nessac marriage and failed. Horth gave up and dispelled the fragmentary ideas. When he opened his eyes, his mother had gone away. He wished his brothers were there. Branst was supposed to be. Someone said they'd seen him at Green Hearth. It seemed impossible he wouldn't stand on Black Hearth with them when Hengst called for challengers. Horth knew why Zrenel wasn't present. He was with the Nessac fleet, waiting for them to join him. He missed Brillet as well. She would be waiting with the other Kimstan down on Black Wedge. Horth checked his sword belt to make sure it felt right and could be unclasped easily in case he was called upon to fight, although he could not imagine the swearing turning into a melee. Nersalians took protocols seriously. Hangst would declare himself for unification as a means to strike the Rishans. If any member of the Kimstan wished to challenge, they would fight immediately. If Hangst lost, it would be Brillet, as his named heir, who was entitled to challenge the victor immediately to retain Hangst's title for him if he survived, or claim it for herself if he did not. If there were multiple challengers, they could sometimes fight each other for the privilege of taking on Liege Nersal. But in none of those scenarios should Horth be called upon to act for his father, Liege, and Admiral. Shaking his apprehensive feeling off, Horth went to join his family at the spiral stairs. Hangst looked hale and well. He smiled at each of them. Then he took Beryl in his arms, held her firmly for a moment, and relinquished her into Zersarn's care. Eller said, "Father, I'm scared." Hangst went down on one knee, took his 8-year-old son by the shoulders and looked him in the eyes. "Akrel, my mischief," he said and smiled. "The Kimstan are family as well. They must have their chance to object by the sword. That is Okal Rel." He had said it much too lightly. He was not afraid. He has worked it out with Brillet, Horth decided, trying to feel relieved. They have reached some acceptable compromise. Suddenly, it was time. Hangst led the way down the spiral stairs. Horth followed. Next came the family errants. Lywolf stayed to guard the entrance to the throat that led to Family Hall, where Beryl would be waiting in the master bedroom with the children and Zersarn. Falk would bring her the news when it was over. He came down with Hangst and Horth onto the octagon. The octagon was decked out as it always was on important occasions, with tier upon tier of Demish witnesses. There were some red Vrelish from Spiral Hall, surrounding a subdued Vretlev Rel. The young Vrelish liege, not long returned from Touchgate Hospital, observed with a sullen air, as if she was only half interested. The new Ava of Rel was on the wedge that had been Delm's and was now hers. She was surrounded by retainers of mixed blood from her possessions in the Reaches called the Knotted Strings. Horth had never seen her before. She did not wear a sword like a Vrelish woman, but did not dress like a Demish one either. She wore dark slacks and a long vest stiff with house braid. She wore her dark hair pulled back from a beautiful but calculating face, and there was a dagger on her slim belt. Her teenage son, Detherd, flanked her, and a sprinkling of Vretlev Rel's nobleborns from Spiral Hall as well. Branst was with the nobleborns on Green Wedge. Horth could not stop staring once he caught sight of him. Branst looked agitated. He wore his sword uneasily, as if it frightened him. He was also the only highborn with the Green Vrelish. Daimon was nowhere to be seen. Tessitat Monitum was not present either. As Horth watched, Branst abandoned his position on Green Wedge and started towards Black Wedge. Suddenly, Horth had a new fear, but for the moment at least, Branst issued no challenge. He just kept walking towards his blood kin, leaving his adopted house behind him. 24 Kimstan, representing all the families of House Nersal, waited in a clump on Black Wedge. All hard-eyed men and women who had the right to kill or be killed if they could not follow where Hangst led. Brillet stood off to one side as Hangst first sworn and named heir in Zrenel's absence. She nodded to Horth when she saw him. Then her attention flickered back to Branst again, as he stopped at the edge of the Kimstan and stood, trembling visibly. Hangst refused to give Branst his attention. He placed himself at the edge of the challenge floor and turned to address his gathered vassals. I have heard from the Zerstan concerning the question of how to deal with Retian stations that oppose us, Hanks told them. He spoke in a voice that carried effortlessly. Horth forgot Branst for the moment to listen. You know why we must conquer the Retians, Hanks continued. They reveal themselves through their use of Lorel's science to extract memories from a Sevolite, like Amel. This is true whether or not you believe, as the Zer-Sis has decreed, that Amel is a Zer-Pol. A stir greeted the use of this emotionally explosive term. The Demish on Silver Wedge broke out in a rash of overlapping objections, creating a babel. Their leaders silenced them with reassurances that what the Nersalians did or did not think about pureblood Amel was of importance only to Nersalians, and after a ruffled minute of disruption, everyone calmed down again. Horth was more interested in noting which members of the Kimp stand looked skeptical, and how many, including Brillet, looked grim. In fact, the look on Brillet's face gave Horth a strange sensation, as if he had overlooked something important. Branst pushed his way forward unexpectedly. Where is Tessitad Monitum, father? He shouted at Hanks Nersal. Their audience was shocked. Members of each house appointed to act as guards of honor glanced at each other, wondering if they should intervene. But Branst was Kimp Stan, and a child of Hank's hearth on Fountain Court. They weren't certain. It was Hanks who responded first. This is not the time nor the correct way to confront me about anything, he told Branst. Go home or go to Green Hearth. We will talk when this is done. It was generous. Hanks could have ordered Branst arrested with a gesture instead. Branst didn't care. I want Tessitad back, he shouted even louder, and he reached to draw his sword. Branst was shaking so hard that the thought of him dueling anyone was absurd. Horth sprinted the short distance between them to wrest the weapon out of his brother's hand. The struggle ended as Horth was joined by two other members of the Kimp Stan. Together, they disarmed Branst and dragged him towards the base of the spiral stairs on Black Wedge. Horth! Branst appealed in desperate confusion, trying to grab at Horth's arm as the other two Kimp Stan forced him along. I can't believe you were with them. The Nessaks kidnapped Tess, forced her down in Killing Reach on her way back. And I told you she knew the jump, Horth. It's my fault. Horth stopped, staring after his hysterical brother as Branst turned his head to shout as loud as he could. Nessaks do what they want and have priests make up excuses. Okal Ani! They are Okal Ani! Without Horth's protective influence, one of Brandt's handlers hit him in the stomach, and he shut up as he doubled over. Take him to his mother, Hanks said. Torn between the ritual still playing out on Black Wedge and his brother's outburst, Horth wavered near the bottom of the stairs as Branst was taken up them. He heard Lywolf receiving him above. Finally, after seconds that seemed to last forever, he turned back. By now, Hangst was firmly in control once more. Horth calmed himself to listen. I know that many of you among the Kimp Stan are conflicted in your feelings about joining with the Nessaks, even in so just a cause, said Hangst. I understand. We are not Nessaks. We're Nersalians. He looked at each face in turn. You fear the doctrines of the Nessaks may dominate our own beliefs. He stopped again, looking powerful and adamant. Then he made a promise. It will never happen. Father sounded so certain. Horth frowned in confusion. It will be the other way around, declared Hangst. Think about it, he challenged them, and waited for a moment before adding, with a rich vein of humor in his commanding voice. Which house is it so far that has issued proclamations of compromise? A ripple of surprised laughter bubbled through the Kimp Stan at this reminder of Zer-Sis Okal's concessions over female warriors, and the possibility that nobleborns might have souls. But not Alice, Horth thought, and suddenly realizing why he had been thinking of her as he got dressed. How many like Alice live on Retian space stations, he wondered. Not perpetrators of mind control over Sevolites, but ordinary people, the kind that Okal Rel was sworn to protect. The greater question, Hangst continued, is how can we fight these Retians at all? They scorn sword law, and surrender their decision-making to lifeless things of science they call arbiters. The Kimp Stan shifted in discomfort. A few looked directly at Brillet, others at Hangst, or about the room to see how the rest of Fountain Court was reacting. "We know how Retians fight when they are dealt with honorably," said Hangst. "We know what they made of killing Reach 200 years ago, when we first encountered them. No one knows better than Liege Brillet, who has spent decades in killing Reach, living with the consequences." Hangst turned to Brillet. "We have lived through terrible things together, and shared triumphs as well. Last night I told you what the Zerstan have decided about the measures we plan to take to defeat the Retians, swiftly, before they can use science against us in ways we cannot even anticipate." He waited for her to nod. "Tell the Kimpstan what you feel," Hangst invited her. Brillet inhaled so deeply it felt as if she might take all the air on the octagon into her lungs before she committed herself. "We stand between two evils," she finally declared. "I have no use for Nessacs. They're compromises." She turned her head to spit on the floor. "Pah! They do and say whatever gains what they desire." She tipped her head towards Blackhearth's spiral stairs. "In that, I do not disagree much with Bransner Sal, however addled he's become." "Retians can destroy our way of life," Brillet returned to the main thrust of her argument. "So can the Nessacs. It comes to this. Someone must decide which threat is greater. Someone must take the burden on his soul of being right or wrong in making this decision. And it is a bitter one, because an error of such magnitude could damn the soul forever. To ignore the warning of a Zerpol on one hand, to condone Okalani acts on the other." She turned to Hangst then. "I am sworn to Liege Nersal. I say, let him decide." In the perfect silence that followed, Hangst touched Brillet's arm in thanks. Then he told the Kimpstan, "I have decided to extend to Nersalians the same exception that the Zerstan have allowed their warriors, for the greater good of all Seveldom. We will crack and cripple every Retian station. We will rebuild our own in Hullsteel once we take their worlds. We must act against Okal Rel, temporarily, in order to save it and extend it afterwards." The reminder of what conquerors could gain was not lost on his audience. Some faces told Horth they did not care that the means of achieving new lands would be Okalani. They were the real threat. Horth saw it so plainly it stunned him. Okalani lust wore many disguises and argued its case in many languages. But it stood naked before him, in those few faces untroubled by the compromise that tortured Brillet. Horth's father ceased to be his father in that instant. He was just a leader, poised to make the wrong decision. Hangst was nothing but his father the next instant, a man about to foul his soul with a terrible error. Horth hardly heard his father speak the mandatory invitation to challengers. He hardly knew who he was as he stepped onto the challenge floor and drew his sword. Horth registered his father's startled look as he stepped forward. Hangst did not understand at first. Brillet did. Hangst heard her suck her breath in. No one else breathed hard enough to be heard. Horth stopped. With his sword gripped in his left hand, he unclasped his belt with his right and threw both belt and sheath clear. He waited. Hangst's lips parted as if he meant to say something, but he stopped. He could see the decision in Horth's face. "Akrel," Hangst said simply, instead, and cleared the regret off his face as he drew his sword. They faced each other, crouching slowly into their fighting stances, but both kept their points lowered. They stared. Horth knew his father was fiercely aggressive as a fighter, as well as technically precise, but Hangst knew that his son had become an expert at defense, largely due to his uncanny sense of body language. The other's confidence gave each of them pause. But it was more than that. There was the finality of it. There would be no room for error in this challenge, and Horth knew it must be to the death to achieve its purpose. Hangst's death, whether or not he survived himself. Whatever happened, wherever Hangst's blade went, Horth must find his father's heart. Hangst took a deep breath and flicked his weapon up. Horth lanced in at the same moment with a single straight thrust to Hank's chest. Hanks instinctively drew his right hand across his body in a tight, perfect parry and stepped back. But Hanks never felt Horth's blade connect, and still waited to parry it as Horth angled his blade a further 45 degrees backward with his wrist, jutting around Hank's blade, and thrusting into Hank's ribs, batting Hank's point away from his face with his right hand. Horth was lucky his point did not lodge in his father's ribs. With the reverse angulation of his wrenched wrist and stretched out to make up the distance, he could neither push the tip as hard as he wished nor recover if Hanks made his own thrust or slash. But he was lucky. His blade pierced flesh and went deep. Horth sheared away, off balance. Hanks stepped back, faltering, Horth's sword still sticking out of his chest. Hanks gripped the blade of Horth's sword in his left hand. He pulled it out with a grunt, looking strangely thoughtful, as if he intended to reenact the action. Mercifully, Horth never met his eyes. It was Brillet that Hanks looked to as his knees buckled. She ran out onto the floor and dropped at his side, taking him in her arms as his wounded heart pumped blood out of his chest. Hanks died in silence. Horth knew he had won. Winning was important. He had forgotten why, but he hung onto the certainty that it was as he watched Brillet climb to her feet, stained with his father's blood, and turned to face him. She was his father's sword heir. It was her duty to challenge him right now if she doubted his right to be Liege Nursal. Behind them, Falk sprinted up the spiral stairs to take the news to Beryl. The Nessaks in the audience on Black Wedge looked paralyzed. "Challenge!" a voice rang out from among the Kimpstan. It was not Brillet, but one of those in whose faces Horth had seen avarice. If Hanks had won, no second Kimpstan could have claimed the right to challenge again immediately. But Horth lacked the political acumen to sidestep new challenges. He picked up his sword from where his father had dropped it, making certain not to look at his handiwork. That was when he heard the thin sounds of screaming coming from the spiral stairs, muted by intervening rooms and distance. The high, piercing voice of a child. "Go," Brillet said sharply, scowling as she stepped between Horth and his challenger. "I was his father's first sworn and heir," she told the challenger. "I'll be his as well. The decision is made, one way or the other." Horth left her to deal with any disappointed Kimpstan and bolted for the spiral stairs. When Falk came to tell them that father was dead, killed by Horth, Eller couldn't believe it. Beryl Nessak shot straight up, dropping her newborn. He hit the floor hard on his head. She stared with wide eyes at the messenger. She didn't seem to notice anything else. Beryl shrieked, "Mother!" Eller clutched a struggling Sanal. Mother had told him to keep hold of her. She had told him that they all had to stay together in the bedroom with Zer Sarn and the spirit knife she had set out on her dresser. His heart was racing hard enough to dizzy him. Beryl formed the word "Hangst" with numb lips. But no breath passed through them. She stared as if her soul had left her body. "It will be swift," Zer Sarn promised, "if we act together." Mother looked at the spirit knife on her dresser. Brance came unstuck from where he sat, staring in disbelief from the chair where he had been deposited. Falk drew his sword to attack Brance, filling Eller with sick dread. This was his family. This wasn't possible. But mad things kept happening. Berylin made a dash for comfort towards their mother. Beryl received her with the spirit knife in her hands. She clutched her daughter to her. She sobbed. And she slit Berylin's throat so fast it was over even before Falk intercepted Brance. Falk's sword went through Brance in the next instant, but Brance turned enough to deflect it a little. Sanal bolted. Eller screamed. His mother was coming for him. Uncle Sarn was trying to catch Sanal. Branst buckled to his knees as Falk went to the door to lock it, carrying his sword under his arm. "Hangst!" Mother wailed like something supernatural, no longer merely human. "Wait, we're coming!" Lywolf stood at the top of the spiral stairs as Horth charged up them. He looked almost as spooked as Horth felt, but Horth didn't know if he could trust him. All he knew was that Eller was screaming. He struck the Nessak aside with a blow that numbed his own arm. Horth charged down the throat through open doors, left that way thanks to Brant's struggling passage through them earlier. In their rush to return to the octagon, the Kimpstan who had escorted him had apparently not taken the time to close them again. Horth was grateful. He ran with all the strength his heart could muster, carrying his sword backwards in his right hand for speed. The screaming began again as he set foot in Family Hall. Eller was shrieking in wordless terror. Horth burst into his parents' master bedroom, knocking Falk away from the door hard enough to buy an instant to take in the mayhem, even as he switched hands on his sword. He saw bodies on the floor. He saw tiny Sanel evade Zersarn's attempt to grab her. He saw Eller staring, frozen, as Beryl walked towards him with a blank expression, holding her spirit knife in a hand already crimson. He saw Brantz drag himself up off the floor, holding his stomach. Then, Falk attacked him. Horth beat off the Nessak's blade and put his own sword through Falk's shoulder, immediately pulling it out and drawing it across the Nessak's neck in a vicious flourish. Sanel got caught. She twisted in Sarn's gasp like a grabbit, but it was no good. He would break her neck in a moment. Brantz staggered to intercept Beryl. Horth made his decision. Zersarn roared when he realized he was going to be interrupted. Horth put his sword through the hated Zer's chest with his left hand as he clamped the hand holding Sanel in his right one. Zersarn had his hand around Sanel's neck, her tiny fingers tugging at his large ones. She was doing her best to bite as well, and kicking furiously. Horth squeezed to make the dying man release her, and succeeded with a final jerk, letting her use his body to break her fall. He turned to see Brantz sink down Beryl's side, still trying to clutch at her with one bloody hand. Beryl stabbed at him, wildly. Fresh blood flowed from his flank and arm. She tugged free, breathing in gasps, and staggered towards Eller. Horth saw Eller would not move, could not even scream any longer. Beryl lurched to plunge her knife in the 8-year-old's body, Brantz still clutching at her from the floor. Horth flung himself towards her, thrusting his sword through her ribcage from the side, feeling it grate along the bone. Then he wrenched it out and spun around in front of her, body-checking her away from his terrified little brother behind him. It was only as he watched Beryl fall that Horth recovered the complexity of thought to see her as the mother who had sent him off to San Home, taught him how to pot plants, and served picnics in the nursery. He did not know what to do with the information. Instead, he let her die, and went to see if Branst was still alive. Branst felt cold as Horth rolled him over to look at him. His eyelids fluttered. "Tessatet," he said, and raised a palsied hand streaked with crimson. "Save her." Brant's heart gave out in Horth's arms. Horth set him down swiftly. He focused on Eller and Sanal, who had united in a clump behind him. He stood to defend them against whatever came through their parents' door next. But it was only Brillet, backed by half a dozen of the Kimpstan. She looked around the room and muttered, "Mad gods." "Mad Nessaks," exclaimed one of the Kimpstan with her, in bitter satisfaction. Horth was glad to see Brillet. He knew she would take care of his surviving siblings. He lowered his sword and shouldered past her, out the door. She turned and followed him for several paces. "Legioner Sal?" She halted him with a cry, when it seemed clear he wouldn't stop otherwise. A shiver went over Horth. He cast about him for his father before he realized his error. He turned back to Brillet and waited. "Where are you going?" she demanded. He said one word in answer. Zrenal. Daimon faced Zrenal Nursal across a couple body lengths of hardwood on Quicksilver's challenge floor. It would be a nice place to die, he decided. He could not afford to do that, however. Not with Tessitad in the balance. She would never voluntarily teach Nessax how to get into the Retian reach of paradise. Her death would not be pleasant. And there was the Zur, who stole the jump from the foolish Retians to consider as well. He simply had to win the duel. It is lovely, Daimon thought, when life becomes so simple, even for a few minutes. Zrenal was young and impatient. Daimon let him glimpse a few chances and drew him out expertly. After the first exchange, they maneuvered around each other for nearly half a minute. Daimon toyed with possibilities, smiling as he watched Zrenal start to go for them and change his mind. "Hank's taught you well," he said, spontaneously. Zrenal didn't say anything. That was wise. It was better to concentrate. Daimon's own concentration may have lapsed while he thought such things. Whatever the reason, he caught his breath with a gasp when he realized he was in the middle of a furious and fatal attack. Instinct and experience took over. Circle, counter, slide, and know the distances to a hair. It felt strangely like a dance that had already been choreographed. He felt Zrenal's sword enter his body and tear sideways. It tore free instead of penetrating because Daimon had killed Zrenal first with his own hilt. They staggered apart. Zrenal fell. Daimon wondered what the Demish would do if both of them died and half laughed at the idea. Pain clutched him with 100 small, insistent fingers that fired to a roar as he took a step and pressed his right hand over the gash above the deeper puncture. He was wounded in the liver. He knew just enough about the kind of Sevolite medicine practiced on Touchgate Hospital to imagine his high-born Vrelish physiology reacting to the grievous insult. Clamping off blood supply where possible, fueling regeneration where necessary, breaking out emergency stores of essential chemicals. He was not going to die immediately, not if he could shut down the bleeding. That's what Seamers were for. Sadly, he had forgotten to bring one to the duel. Oh well, Daimon thought, and sank down on one knee. It felt more comfortable. He heard feet running towards him. Renar was beside him the next moment. But to Daimon's immense relief, Renar did nothing demonstrative. Instead, he had brought one of the Retian medics with him. Daimon thought the woman looked the worse for wear, and doubted that she understood his bullying earlier had been in the interest of the greater good. Even if she did, people could hold a grudge. He flinched away from the woman's attempt to inspect his wound. "Don't be stupid," Renar cried. "You could bleed to death." A 6th guard of their Demish hosts were approaching, no doubt with Seamers. Daimon glared at Renar, who expected him to trust an unknown Retian he had just recently injured, and then at the woman, who looked annoyingly earnest in her professional concern. "Can you be quick?" Daimon asked curtly, in Retian, the pain doing nothing to improve his diplomacy. A trio of Nessac observers was approaching. She nodded. He lowered the arm shielding his wound with trepidation. The Retian's hands were shaking, but she cut away the sliced and sodden cloth over the wound with satisfying speed, slapped on something that stung like mad, covered it with a strange device a handspan in circumference, and whipped a band around the whole affair as wide as the first aid device and tight enough to hold it snug. The band sealed and tightened with a magical dispatch. A coolness spread where the first aid disc was doing things Daimon was loath to know about. It felt as if the side pressed to his skin was full of tiny sweeping tentacles, for a start. It also oozed something that sealed off the bleeding. Trying to ignore the thing, Daimon forced himself to his feet with enough vigor to make the medic gasp. She did not seem at all pleased by a patient with an independent agenda. As he turned to face the Nessacs and the Demish, Daimon heard her babbling dire warnings to Renar, who tried to explain in terms that included the words Sevolite and Highborn. Daimon was somewhat irked to hear the Rician word for idiot as well. Did Renar imagine he was at leisure to lie down and be ill when there were still 3 Nessac battle wheels on their doorstep? It was not as if he would mind. If he was going to die of his wound, he'd rather do it lying down shot up on Clinamen than like this. He greeted the Nessac who had just succeeded Zrenal with a cynical sneer. The Demish had brought Tessitat and the Nessac Zer with them. According to the terms of the duel, Prince Hans said with an officious air, you have custody of the Nessac hitchhiker and, of course, your niece. Tessitat moved silently to Daimon's side. That looks bad, the Nessac remarked, nodding at the wound high in Daimon's abdomen. The Rician first aid thing must have contained drugs, or else it was combining with Daimon's own physiology to strange effect. He suffered a wave of giddiness as he answered almost jauntily, feels worse. On the crest of that disconnected feeling, he turned to the Nessac Zer, who stood waiting tensely, his hands bound behind his back and his feet hobbled. Jump stealing is typically punished by those you offend against, Daimon said, testing the grip on the sword he still held, naked, in his left hand. But I don't trust the Ricians to show sense. Without waiting for anyone to raise an objection or alternative, Daimon whipped the sharp third of his sword across the prisoner's throat, opening his jugular. The Rician medic yelped a cry and fainted. That kept Renar busy, fortunately. This isn't over, Greenhearth, said the new Nessac armed commander, glaring bitterly at Daimon. The Nersalian fleet will be here to join us any moment. Then we'll see how this is resolved. He narrowed his eyes. Hanks Nersal may decide to start with those who protect Ricians. He glanced at the alien-looking dressing on Daimon's chest, and are fool enough to trust their science. Daimon was ready to agree with him about that. The Rician first aid disc was seriously upsetting his composure. It was all he could do to keep still as the Nessacs collected their dead Zer and withdrew towards the docks, shadowed by a Demish honor guard. Sweat began to pop out on Daimon's brow as his giddiness progressed to a rising sensation of burning, centered on the wound. His insulted, aggressive immune system was fighting back. He swayed and toppled into Tessitat and Renar's arms. Get it off, Daimon said. The Rician medic was conscious again, but in no condition to be useful to anyone. She wasn't accustomed to watching people being murdered in front of her. Tessitat did what Daimon asked. Afterwards, one of the Demish volunteered a seamer. Renar turned away, looking faint, as the Demish man seared Daimon's wound closed, penetrating deep enough to cauterize internal bleeding as well. What they did would kill a non-regenerative human. It was crude, but it left Daimon quasi-functional once he recovered from the agony enough to stand up. A foreign, acid smell of burned Rician sealant accompanied the more familiar reek of burned flesh and blood. That blood is bad, Tessitat fretted at him, helping him stand. Daimon kept his teeth gritted against the useless groans of pain, thinking angrily to himself, I know it's bad. Why wouldn't anyone focus on the war that was about to happen? Why did he have to worry about it in his condition? We have to get him to Touchgate Hospital, said Tessitat. Get me to the bridge, Daimon said angrily. I have to be there when Hanks shows up. I have to talk to him. Try, somehow. I don't think Hanks will talk, said Prince Han, in an interested but detached manner, as if the whole thing was a particularly excellent Demish play. You just killed his son. Good point, thought Daimon, but he didn't know what else to do. Renar argued with Tessitat about the merits of disobedience all the way up to the bridge, but he helped support Daimon's weight on the other side. They set him down in a chair at the comm station. Tess stayed with him. Renar agitated for another channel to call the Rician station nearby. What for? Daimon cut across the Ricians' negotiations with the Demish. You need medical help, Renar snapped. His usually relaxed body was electric with emotional alarm. Not Rician help, Daimon answered just as furiously, sweating from his feverish response to Rician drugs. I've tried that. But Touchgate Hospital, insisted Tessitat. All right, Renar snapped right back, but I'm going with you. You can't, she protested. Why not? Argued Renar. You won't be flying very hard, I think, with him in that condition. No one is going to Touchgate Hospital, Daimon thought with exasperation, beneath a haze of mild delirium. Because the Nersalians are going to show up and start a major war. We've got battle wheels incoming, a Demish officer called, picking up the latest data dump from Quicksilver's wards. Daimon closed his eyes. Tense minutes later, the next dump arrived, and the officer amended. They're fielding wards and dropping out of skim themselves. He laughed a bit hysterically. Good thing. We're tight enough to split space at the seams around here. I've got an electromagnetic signal, said another officer. A request to communicate on an audio-visual channel from Liege Nersal. Daimon sat forward painfully, not sure which he dreaded most. The disaster that lay ahead when the Unification Alliance took out the Retian station in frustration over the jump, or facing Hangst with Zrenal's death on his conscience. Odd, he thought, how relationships skew things so out of proportion, but he couldn't help it. This was not how his friendship with Hangst Nersal ought to have ended, not just with disagreement, but with hatred. To balance his feelings, he reminded himself Hangst must have known what had befallen Tessitat, even if he had let the Nessaks do the dirty work. Hangst needed that jump to make the Nessaks and Nersalians come together. Maybe Renar is right, Daimon thought sadly. Retians will have to deal with us eventually, and we with them. All I've done is put off the inevitable. He still doubted whether his Retian friend grasped the enormity of a Sevolite invasion. At least they had averted disaster for the time being. He wondered if Hangst would be canny enough to take the Retians on the half-finished station prisoner in hope of netting pilots, which reminded him of the Retian pilot in custody on board the Quicksilver. He really ought to kill the man before the Nessaks could get hold of him. The comm display in front of Daimon switched on, revealing a head-and-shoulder visual to complement voice communications. Daimon started at the sight of Horth Nersal. He was about to ask where Hangst was when he noticed the liege marks on Horth's collar. Tessitat, Horth Nersal requested. She moved to share the visual with Daimon. Here, she told him. Horth, what's happened? It is Okalani to crack stations, Horth said flatly, even with the Zerstan's approval. Such few simple words, thought Daimon. Such important words. Words he had no difficulty translating into what must have played out between Horth and his father on the Octagon. I am glad we agree about that, Daimon said, finding it hard to breathe properly. Akrel. Akrel, Horth answered immediately. Daimon forced himself to remember the Retians, even as he thought, damn the Retians. What will you do now? He asked Horth. What would Brance do? The new Liege Nersal asked Tessitat. Tessitat began to look anxious. She put a hand on the console, her fingers slowly curling into a fist. Horth, she said carefully. Brance, is he... Dead, Horth said. Trouble, with Nessaks. Tessitat stopped breathing, as if she'd been winded. Mad gods, Daimon thought, wishing suddenly that he had taken the time to understand Hank's silent child better. What goes on in that head of his? Tessitat gripped Daimon's arm as she struggled for self-possession. I think, she said, and faltered on a grief too fresh to manage. Horth, I think Brance would have wanted the Nessaks to go back to Sanhome. Horth nodded. Then he grinned at her suddenly, shockingly, making her eyes widen. Branstadt, he declared. Tessitat's nails bit into Daimon's bare forearm. Her throat worked. Yes, she answered, tentatively. To you, said Horth. For Branst. No right of challenge. He paused, aware the sentence wasn't well formed. He made up for it with extra finality as he said, "Granted." An infinitely fragile silence followed, in which Daimon dared to hope for a saner tomorrow. "Horth," Daimon said, almost kindly, touched by grief and pain and miracles. "Thank you, but you must know the Kimp stand you'll be challenged." "Akrel," said Liege Nursal,